The execution platform stood above a sea of thousands, and every single one of them was screaming for her blood. Aurelia Nightthorn, the Omega who never shifted, the cursed girl who carried shame like a second skin, stood in chains before the king she had loved since she was old enough to understand what love meant. And King Darius Thorncrest, the most powerful alpha in the Moonfang Empire, wouldn't even look at her. That silence, that single refusal to meet her eyes, that's what broke something permanent inside her chest. Stay with me through every second of this story, because what happens next will destroy everything you think you know about strength, about power, and about what it really means to survive when the entire world decides you are never worth saving. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know exactly where you're watching from. And let's begin. The chains were iron, but they had wound strips of silver-threaded cord beneath the shackles where iron met skin. A precaution, the royal guard captain had explained to his subordinates, because even a dormant wolf carried latent strength in the blood. Standard protocol for an exile of this magnitude. Aurelia thought that was almost funny. She had spent 22 years being called the weakest wolf in the Empire. Now they were afraid enough to double bind her wrists. The execution platform rose 40 feet above the main courtyard of the Thorncrest Royal Palace, a deliberate architectural choice made 2 centuries prior by some long-dead king who understood that spectacle was its own kind of governance. The crowd below was not a crowd in any intimate sense. It was a city folded onto itself, a mass of bodies so dense that the individual faces blurred into a single roaring texture of open mouths and raised fists. The Moonfang Empire's 5 great noble houses had each sent their full delegations: merchants, soldiers, servants, craftspeople. Thousands of wolves who had grown up hearing her name spoken like a curse word had shown up before dawn to watch her fall. The autumn air tasted like smoke. 3 of the eastern districts had been burning since the previous night. Not from any attack, but from celebration bonfires that had gotten out of hand. The Empire was already partying over her exile. Aurelia breathed in the smoke and held it in her lungs for a moment before releasing it slowly. She was still standing. That mattered. Whatever happened next, she would not give them the image of a woman crumbling. The royal herald stood at the platform's edge with a scroll that had been prepared 4 days ago, which meant the verdict had been decided long before the public hearing. She had suspected as much. The theater of justice in the Moonfang Empire was exactly that, theater. The audience was permitted to believe the story had a middle when really someone else had already written the ending. By decree of His Sovereign Majesty King Alpha Darius Thorncrest, ruler of the 5 houses, keeper of the Moonbound Pact, the herald's voice was trained to carry. It filled the courtyard with practiced authority, each syllable weighted and deliberate. The woman known as Aurelia Nightthorn, ward of House Nightthorn, is hereby stripped of all noble designations, expelled from the bounds of the Moonfang Empire's territory, and sentenced to permanent exile within the death zone, effective immediately upon the reading of this decree. The roar from the crowd was physical. Aurelia felt it in her ribs. She kept her eyes on Darius. He sat on the temporary throne they had erected on the platform above her, a portable version of the Moonstone seat, dragged out for public ceremonies when the king needed his authority visible at eye level with the masses. He was dressed in his full regalia, the black and silver armor of the Thorncrest bloodline, the crown of forged moonstone and dark iron, the heavy cloak lined with shadow wolf fur that had been in his family for 6 generations. He looked exactly like a king was supposed to look. He looked like a stranger wearing the face of the boy she had grown up beside. His jaw was set. His shoulders were straight. His silver eyes, the same eyes she had memorized at age 7 when she'd decided she would love him until she died, were fixed on some point beyond the crowd, beyond the city, beyond the horizon, anywhere that wasn't her face. The deliberateness of it was what carved the wound deepest, not the exile itself, not the chains, not the crowd screaming for her blood. He had chosen to look away. She understood, in that moment, with a cold and surgical clarity that surprised her with its precision, that she had been alone for much longer than today. She had simply not allowed herself to see it. Aurelia Nightthorn, the royal guard captain, a broad-shouldered wolf named Corden, whose youngest daughter had been one of Aurelia's childhood companions before the social calculus of the court made that friendship too expensive, stepped toward her with the formal posture of a man doing his duty rather than thinking about it. "Do you have any final words before the decree is executed?" The courtyard went quieter. Not silent. The crowd was too large and too worked up for silence. But the front rows hushed, and the effect rippled backward through the mass of bodies. People craned their necks. Several of the noble delegations had moved to better vantage points. They wanted to hear this. Aurelia took her time. She looked at the 5 noble house representatives arrayed behind Darius's throne. Lord Vance Crestholt of House Crestholt, who had been her primary accuser during the tribunal. Lady Seraphine Duval of House Duval, who had provided the falsified healer's attestation about her failed awakening. Old Marquis Alderon Voss of House Voss, who had sat through 3 days of hearings with his eyes half closed and his mouth curved in the patient smile of a man who already knew the outcome. Countess Mira Aldrin of House Aldrin, the only one whose eyes showed something that might have been discomfort. General Roe Thornwick of House Thornwick, who commanded the Empire's eastern armies and who had been, as far as Aurelia could determine, simply bought. She looked at them for a long moment, individually, making each of them feel the weight of her attention. Then she looked back at Darius. He was still looking elsewhere. "No," she said. "I don't." The quiet that followed was different from the quiet before, more uncertain. They had wanted a speech, she realized, a denunciation, a plea, a breakdown, something they could respond to, something that would make the execution of the decree feel like a conversation they had participated in, rather than a sentence being handed to a woman who had already been decided upon. She gave them nothing. Captain Corden nodded, and 2 of his guards stepped forward to take her arms. She walked without being pulled. That was the last thing she controlled, the manner of her walking. Head straight, spine upright, the chains around her wrists held parallel to the ground rather than hanging. She was not going to let the weight of them drag her shoulders down. Not here. Not in front of all of them. As they led her past the throne toward the platform's rear stairs, she was close enough to Darius that she could hear his breathing change. The slight catch of it. The controlled exhale through his nose that she recognized from years of being near him. The breath he used when he was suppressing something he didn't want visible. She stopped walking. The guards hadn't expected it, and for 2 seconds they simply stood there, her arms in their hands, waiting. "Darius," she said. His name. Just his name. Not his title, not a formal address, not a plea. His name the way she had always said it, the way that was native to her mouth because she had said it 10,000 times in their shared history. When they were children racing through the palace gardens, when they were adolescents studying bloodline law in the same library, when they were adults and the distance between them had become a formal thing decorated with titles and protocol. His shoulders moved, nearly imperceptible, the smallest possible acknowledgement, but he still didn't look at her. "This is not a threat," she said quietly, calmly. The way a person speaks when they have moved beyond the emotional register of threats into something harder and more permanent. "I want you to know that. What I'm about to say has nothing to do with anger." His jaw tightened. "Someday," she said, "you are going to stand in front of the truth about what happened here, about what was done, about what you chose." She paused. "And I hope, for your sake, that the empire you sacrificed everything for is still standing when that day comes, because you're going to need someone to rule when the grief hits you." She turned away before he could respond, before she could know whether he would have. The guards walked her down the stairs and through a corridor carved into the platform's base, and the crowd's roar swallowed her like a tide. They didn't transport exiles to the death zone in style. A prison wagon, iron wood construction, barred windows barely wide enough for a hand, carried her through the capital city's eastern gate and onto the military road that ran toward the Empire's edge. 4 mounted guards rode ahead, 6 behind. Captain Corden himself rode alongside, which Aurelia understood as both precaution and perhaps a small gesture of respect. He was not going to delegate this to someone who might be cruel about it. She sat in the wagon's corner with her chained wrists resting on her knees and watched the city she had grown up in unspool past the iron bars. The merchant quarter with its stacked signage and perpetual noise. the craftsman's district where she had once spent an entire afternoon watching a woman repair a shattered mosaic with nothing but paste and patience. The eastern residential neighborhoods where ordinary wolves lived in ordinary houses and argued about ordinary things. The temple quarter yet. She looked away from that, from habit, and from something else she couldn't name yet. The people on the street stopped to watch the wagon pass. Some of them she recognized. Some of them she had known by name. A few looked away with the studied casualness of people pretending they hadn't seen something they didn't want to think about. Most simply stared. A boy of perhaps 10, perched on a market stall's loading platform, pointed at her through the bars and said something to the woman beside him. The woman nodded without looking at Aurelia directly. This is what you become in the story people tell, she thought. An object lesson. A cautionary tale. A name spoken to children as evidence of what happens when you don't perform correctly. She had spent her entire life trying to perform correctly. She had awakened her wolf too slowly for the Empire's institutional timeline, or so the official record said, which was not the same as what had actually happened, but the distance between official records and actual events was the machinery that kept people like Lord Vance Crestholt in power. She had scored highly in bloodline theory and battle strategy and 4 dialects of inter-kingdom diplomatic language. She had trained harder than wolves who had fully functioning wolves to train with, which meant she had spent years working twice as hard for half the acknowledgement, because effort without visible results reads to observers as failure, regardless of what's actually occurring in the body of the person doing the work. None of it had mattered. She pressed her spine against the wagon's wall and let herself feel the full weight of that for exactly 1 minute. She counted it out. 60 seconds of grief she did not try to manage or reframe or metabolize into something more palatable. 60 seconds of feeling the specific texture of what it was like to be betrayed not by an enemy, but by the person you had structured your understanding of safety around. At 60 seconds, she was done. Not because the grief was gone, but because she had a long road ahead and she understood instinctively the way certain kinds of understanding bypass language and seat themselves directly in the body. That people who survive impossible things do not do so by spending their energy on what can no longer be changed. They spend it on what can. The wagon rolled east, Banished. The military road ended at a border station 40 miles from the capital. A sparse compound of stone buildings and a watchtower, manned by 12 soldiers whose primary job appeared to be making sure nothing crossed from the death zone's edge into the Empire's territory. The crossing happened in the other direction only rarely, and always under orders. They unloaded her in the compound's central yard as the light was failing. Late afternoon, the sun dropping behind clouds that had moved in during the last hour of the journey. The air was colder here, measurably colder, with a quality to it that wasn't just weather, a faint pressure at the back of the sinuses, a slight metallic edge on the tongue. She had felt it once before, when she was 12 and Darius had dared her to approach the border station on a summer trip to the Eastern Territories. She hadn't made it within a quarter mile before the pressure had become headache, and the headache had become something else. A pulling sensation in her chest like a piece of her was being called toward whatever lay beyond the compound's eastern wall. She had run back then. She stood still now. Captain Corden dismounted and walked to her himself to remove the chains. His hands were practiced and impersonal, but when the iron fell away and he stepped back, he looked at her with an expression that hadn't been cleared of everything the way it should have been. "You have 1 hour of light left," he said. His voice had dropped to something that wasn't quite official register. "The terrain within the first mile is passable. After that—" He stopped. "I can't tell you anything useful about after that." "I know," she said. He reached into his coat and produced a pack. Canvas, military issue, worn in the way of something that had been used before. He held it out to her. She didn't move for a moment. "Captain's discretion," he said. "Provisions? Knife? Flint." A pause. "I have a daughter your age." She took the pack. He stepped back into official posture and did not say anything else. But she understood, as she turned toward the compound's eastern gate and heard it grind open on its iron hinges, that in his way he had said everything he could afford to say. The gate closed behind her. The death zone did not announce itself with drama. This surprised her. She didn't know exactly what she had expected. A wall of darkness, a visible boundary between the world she knew and whatever waited beyond it. some theatrical signal that she had crossed into condemned territory. What she got instead was a gradual dimming, a slow, incremental loss of the light's warmth, as though the afternoon sun had been replaced by its own shadow, the same shape and position but drained of heat. The grass under her boots went from the dry, late-season yellow of the Empire's eastern fields to something darker, a color she didn't have a name for. Not brown, not gray, not the black of rich soil, but some combination of all three that suggested the ground had decided to stop participating in the concept of color. She walked. The terrain in the first mile was, as Corden had said, passable. Rocky in places, uneven, the kind of ground that required attention underfoot, but manageable if you were paying attention. She was paying attention. She cataloged everything, the texture of the soil, the species of plant life, twisted, low to the ground, leaves with an iridescent dark sheen that caught no light but seemed to absorb it, the quality of sound, which was wrong in ways she couldn't immediately specify. Too flat, maybe, as though the air itself were thicker here and sound had to push through it, or as though the landscape were listening and had decided not to respond. She found a dry hollow in the shelter of a stone outcrop as the last of the light went out and made camp in the way her basic survival training had taught her. Not military training, which she had been denied for the obvious reason that Exiled doesn't get to carry weapons proficiency certifications, but the fundamental competence that her bloodline tutor had quietly, carefully embedded in her curriculum years ago. The man had never explained why he included wilderness survival in a course nominally about diplomatic protocol. She had never asked. Some gifts arrive wrapped in other things. She ate sparingly. Half of what Corden had packed for provisions, keeping the rest. The knife she tested against her thumb, sharp, standard military issue, kept clean. The flint was good quality. She had enough to work with. The night came down like a fist. Not darkness. Real darkness. The absence of light sources kind she was accustomed to from growing up in a palace with its perpetual torches. But something with texture and intention to it. She sat in the hollow with her back to the stone and her eyes open and watched it settle, and the watching told her things. There were shapes in the darkness that were darker than the darkness itself. There were sounds, not close, but not distant enough, that had no clear animal source. There was a wind that moved in directions that didn't correspond to any meteorological logic she understood, eddying inward rather than across, as though the death zone generated its own weather, and that weather had its own preoccupations. She counted her heartbeats until they steadied. If you panic in the dark, you die in the dark. The voice that said this in her head was not hers. It was her old bloodline tutor's, dry and practical and utterly devoid of sentiment about the nature of survival. Panic is a metabolic event. It burns energy you don't have and narrows your perception precisely when you need your perception widest. The opposite of panic is not calm. It is attention. She paid attention. The shapes did not approach. The sounds stayed at their distance. After a long period she couldn't precisely measure, she allowed herself to close her eyes and sleep in intervals, 15, 20 minutes at a stretch, snapping back to full awareness at the slightest change in the surrounding texture of sound. She survived the first night by being, above everything else, awake. The first week was the education. She learned the death zone's internal logic through the brute method of getting things wrong and surviving the getting it wrong. She learned that the black rivers moved against gravity in places and that drinking from them would make her sick for a full day, but that the sickness passed and left her, when she recovered, slightly more able to process the taste of the water the next time. She learned that the darkness within darkness shapes were not all the same. Some were aggressive within a certain proximity and receded when she held her ground and stared them down, which worked better than running because running activated something in them, and some were passive and less touched, which she figured out the hard way on the third day when she reached for what appeared to be a large dark stone, and it unfolded 4 appendages and launched itself sideways with a shriek that cost her a strip of skin along her left forearm. She cleaned the wound with the last of the clean water in her pack, and packed it with moss that the ground here grew in silver-green clusters along the northern faces of rocks, which she had noticed the passive shapes avoided, which suggested the moss had properties. The wound didn't close as quickly as a normal wolf's wound would have. It closed. She was not dead. This was day by day the metric she held on to, Not comfort, not progress, not success in any form her former life would have recognized. Just the singular, unadorned fact of her continued existence on this side of the line between living and not. But something else was happening alongside the survival learning. The death zone was responding to her. Not obviously. Not in the grand theatrical manner of the old stories, not with ancient voices from the earth or spectral apparitions delivering prophecy. It was smaller than that, and stranger, and consequently more convincing. The aggressive shapes started pulling back their perimeter earlier. Not because she had gotten better at standing her ground, though she had, but because they appeared to be reassessing her, the way a predator reassesses prey that has turned out to be more complicated than anticipated. The passive shapes stopped startling when she passed. The black rivers ran calmer in the section she approached, as though the water had been told to expect her. On the 9th day, she came over a ridge and found a valley. The valley was wrong in all the ways the death zone was wrong, but it was also, in some quality she couldn't categorize, right? The air pressure she'd been breathing against for over a week eased by several degrees. The ground in the valley's center was darker than the surrounding terrain, not the dead dark of the plains she'd been crossing, but a dark that held depth, like the difference between a painted wall and a window. Something grew in that dark center. Not moss, not the low-twisted plants. Something tall, with a structure that suggested it had been growing for longer than she could calculate. And that reached upward with branches that split into smaller branches that split again into something finer than any leaf she recognized. She stood at the ridge for a long time. A sound came from the valley, not from any direction specifically, from the air itself, from the depth quality of the dark in the center. She would have said it was her name if she were the kind of person who accepted things like that without question. She was not that kind of person. She filed it under possible auditory hallucination generated by 9 days of exhaustion and inadequate nutrition and the general atmospheric strangeness of the death zone. And she went down into the valley anyway, because the valley had the eased pressure, and she needed the eased pressure. And she was, above all, a person who went toward things rather than away from them when going away wasn't solving the problem. The tree, she had decided it was a tree, for lack of better terminology, was vast at its base, wider than she could have encompassed with her arms if she'd wrapped them around it, which she didn't because she had learned by now not to touch things without more information. Its bark was black with a texture like compressed shadow, not rough and not smooth, but somewhere between them, with a quality she associated with things that were old in ways that required different adjectives than the ones she had available. She sat down with her back against a different stone, 3 body lengths from the tree's base, and looked at it. "I'm not going to pretend I know what you are," she said aloud. Talking was a survival mechanism she had adopted on day 4 when the silence had started to feel like a presence of its own. "I'm also not going to promise I won't run if something alarming happens. I probably will, but I'm here, and I'm going to keep being here because there's nowhere else to go." The tree did nothing visible. The air pressure eased another ½ degree. She ate the last of Cordon's provisions and looked at the branches overhead and thought about everything she wasn't going to think about. Darius's eyes fixed on the horizon, the crowd's roar, the herald's trained voice reading her erasure aloud like an administrative task. And she thought about those things anyway because refusing to think about them would have required energy she didn't have, and because the thinking, if she let it run to its end rather than suppressing it mid-sentence, arrived at the same conclusion every time. She was still here. They had put her in the worst place they could imagine, and she was still here. That was information about her, not about them. On the 14th day, the monster came. Not one of the shapes. Those she had developed, if not a relationship with, at least a working understanding of. This was different. She heard it before she saw it, a sound like the earth beneath her feet deciding to change its mind about being solid, a low subsonic frequency that she felt in her back teeth more than her ears. She was crossing a section of the Black Plains when it started, heading toward a shelf of higher ground where she'd spotted what looked like a water source the previous day. She stopped. The sound increased. The ground wasn't vibrating exactly. It was more that the ground had stopped being the kind of thing that simply existed beneath you and had become something that was aware of you being on top of it. Then the creature came over the plain's far edge, and she understood the scale problem. It was larger than the border compound she'd been exiled through. That was her first organizing thought. Not an emotional response, but a spatial calibration, because the part of her mind that was still running survival assessment needed reference points. 4 legs, each one thick as an ancient tree, and a body that moved with the weighted deliberateness of something that had never in its life encountered an obstacle it needed to think about. Its head, she couldn't find a good analogy for the head, which was low and broad and had what appeared to be a second set of features behind the first, as though 2 faces had been pressed together in the same forward-facing plane. Its eyes, all 4 of them, were the pale gray of bone in strong light. It was looking directly at her. In the 3 seconds between the moment she fully registered what she was looking at and the moment she made a decision, she processed the following. She could not outrun it. The plane's open terrain offered nothing to use as cover or barrier. The higher ground was behind the creature rather than in front of her. And she had a knife which was, against this particular problem, the equivalent of bringing a sentence to a war. She stood still. The thing stopped walking. They regarded each other across 200 yards of black plain. Then, in a movement so slow it initially read as more stillness, the creature lowered its massive head until the jaw nearly touched the ground. It was not a posture of aggression. She had spent enough time around wolves in their secondary forms to read body language across species. The head lowering was not submission in any simple sense. This creature was too enormous for the concept of submission to be fully applicable to it, the same way the ocean can't really be said to bow. But the gesture carried something. Recognition, maybe. Or something stranger, something that didn't have a clean word in her available vocabulary. She took 1 step forward. The creature's 4 pale eyes tracked her. She took another. At 30 yards, she could smell it. Not an animal smell, not the musk and soil and physical heat of a living creature, but something older, something that reminded her of the Black River's smell, if the rivers were made of something other than water. Ancient, cold, complicated in ways she couldn't parse. She stopped there and looked up at the low, broad head and the 4 bone-gray eyes and said, because she had decided on day 4 that talking to things was a survival mechanism and she was committing to it fully, I don't know what you want. The creature made a sound, not the subsonic frequency from before, something different, something that sat in a register her ears could hold. It was not language, but it carried the shape of language the way a river carries the shape of the terrain it flows through. She filed this under things that require further information and walked to the higher ground she'd been trying to reach, and the creature turned, slowly, the turn itself taking the better part of a minute, and moved away across the plain, and she watched it go until it crested the far edge and disappeared. That night, camped on the higher shelf with access to the water source she'd identified, she lay on her back and looked at the sky. The Death Zone's sky was not black the way nighttime skies were black. It was layered, dark upon dark, with variations in depth that suggested the darkness had dimension to it. The way deep water has dimension even when you can't see the bottom. There were things moving in those layers. High up. Too high and too fast to distinguish. She watched them for a long time. The thing about exile, she thought, the thing nobody discusses in the administrative language of decrees and border compounds and 1 hour of light remaining, is that it forces a particular confrontation with what you actually are versus what you've been told you are. Every structure she had grown up inside, the palace, the noble court, the system of houses and hierarchies and bloodline rankings, those structures had, at every point, defined her in relation to their own requirements. She had been the girl who didn't awaken on schedule, the ward without a functional wolf, the omega who failed the metrics. Take those structures away and put her in a place where none of that framing applied. And what remained? Apparently, a woman who had survived 14 days in the place everything died in, who had faced down things that should have killed her, who had, somewhere in the last 2 weeks, stopped flinching at the sound of wind moving through the dead dark landscape and started reading it instead, listening for what it was actually saying, rather than reacting to the fact that it was strange. That shift, from flinching to reading, was not courage in the romantic sense. It was adaptation. It was the organism doing what organisms do when the environment insists on it. But she was starting to suspect that what people called courage, when they actually encountered it in themselves, felt less like bravery and more like this. The moment when you ran out of the energy required to be afraid of something you were going to face regardless, and redirected that energy toward figuring out how to survive it. The death zone had not broken her. She was not sure yet what that meant, but she intended to find out. On the 21st day, she fell. It was not dramatic. No cliff edge, no creature, no disaster. She had been walking for 9 hours across a section of terrain that proved longer than her estimate, and the last half-mile was a slope she navigated in failing light, and her left boot caught a crack in the rock she hadn't seen, and she went down hard on her right knee and both palms. She lay there for a moment, face down, smelling the death zone's ground. That mineral, old, dark smell that she had stopped consciously noticing 2 weeks ago, and felt the pain of the knee bloom up through her leg and the sting of torn palms and didn't get up immediately. Not because she couldn't, because she was very tired. Get up, she told herself. She got up. The knee bled through her pants. She tied a strip of cloth around it, pulled it tight, kept walking. This was the part nobody told you about survival. Not the monsters, not the grand confrontations, not the moments of dramatic decision under impossible pressure. The part nobody told you about was the 21st day, when you were tired in a way that had moved below bone into something more fundamental, and there was nothing particular happening, no crisis, no spectacle, and you had to get up and walk anyway because the alternative was to lie down in the death zone and let it take you, and she had decided not to let it take her, and decisions without action are just wishes wearing the wrong clothing. She walked until she reached the higher ground she'd been heading for and made camp and ate and slept. When she woke, the Dark Trees Valley was visible in the middle distance, closer than she expected. She had been circling toward it without realizing, or the valley had been moving toward her. She lay still for a moment in the pale, not quite light of the death zone's approximation of morning and considered that possibility with the seriousness it probably deserved. Then she shouldered her pack and started walking. The second time she approached the tree, the valley was different, not changed physically. The terrain was the same, the depth dark center was the same, the tall structure with its splitting branches was the same. But the pressure had shifted further. It was not the easing of pressure she'd felt before, the relief of slightly less atmospheric weight. It was something active, a presence in the air that hadn't been present before, or that she hadn't been able to feel before. She walked to 3 body lengths from the base and stopped. The presence intensified. Not frightening. Not anything she could map onto the human emotional register with precision. Older than frightening. More foundational, something that predated the distinction between threatening and safe, because those categories were products of a world that had something to protect and something to fear losing. And whatever this presence was, it didn't appear to operate inside those categories. "You've been pulling me back here," she said. The air responded. Not with words, with pressure. The kind of pressure that preceded translation rather than the translation itself. "I need you to understand something," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she'd expected, with an edge to it that she recognized as the tone she used when she was speaking her most exact truth. "I don't know what I am to you. I don't know what this place thinks I am, or what history I'm supposed to be standing inside. I just know that I came here with nothing, and I've kept myself alive for 3 weeks, and I'm going to keep keeping myself alive. And if there's something here that has opinions about me, I'm willing to have that conversation. But not on terms I didn't agree to. Not because I was dragged back here by atmospheric pressure and dark trees." She stopped. The presence shifted. And then the ground beneath the tree opened. Not violently. No crack, no sound. Just a slow and purposeful opening, like a hand uncurling. From the aperture that formed, light rose. Not moonlight. Not the death zone's false, not quite light. A color she had no name for. Somewhere between the silver of Darius's eyes and the black of the death zone's rivers. A color that existed between those two things. That was what you got when you combined them and discovered that combination was not gray, but something else entirely. From the light came a voice, not heard with her ears. Felt in the place behind her sternum where she'd been carrying the hollow grief of everything she'd lost. Felt in her blood the way cold water is felt rather than heard when you submerge. It said, she would spend a long time later trying to render this in language and conclude that she couldn't, not precisely, but the closest she could get was, it said, "You are not the last of us. You are the first of us returning." And then the light went out. And in the sudden darkness, Aurelia's spine went rigid as something beneath her skin. Something that had been coiled in her marrow since before she could remember, since before she had language for it. Something she had been told did not exist because the people who told her things had needed it not to exist, unspooled. It was not a wolf. It was not anything the Empire's biology texts had categories for. It was old in the way the tree was old, in the way the Death Zone's darkness was old, in the way things are old when they predate the vocabulary built to describe them. It rose through her like a tide answering a moon, and it burned along every nerve she had, and she opened her mouth, and what came out was not a sound she recognized from her own throat. The Death Zone went completely, catastrophically silent. Every shape in the darkness within 2 miles went still. The ground stopped behaving like ground, and from somewhere far above, in the layered dark sky she had been watching for 3 weeks, the creatures she had never been able to distinguish came lower and lower, and she could see now that they had wings, vast, membrane-thin, dark as the sky they'd been folded into, and they were circling her. And she understood, with the part of herself that was no longer afraid of what she couldn't name, that they were not circling to attack. They were waiting for her to remember who she was. And below the ground, deep enough to shake the bedrock of the Empire 1,000 miles away, something ancient and massive and impossibly patient turned over in its long sleep and opened its eyes. The silence lasted exactly long enough to mean something. Not the comfortable silence of a world going about its business in the dark. Not the ordinary hush of deep night in a wilderness where creatures had simply decided to sleep. This was the silence of attention. Every entity within 2 miles of that valley holding itself in complete stillness while it processed something it had never encountered before and needed to classify. Aurelia stood at the center of it with her spine rigid and her blood on fire. The thing unspooling through her wasn't painful exactly, though pain was the closest word her nervous system had available. It was more that every cell in her body was being asked to remember something it had been told to forget, and the remembering required a kind of physiological reorganization that her 22 years of normal biological function had not prepared her for. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, not from fear, from the effort of remaining upright while something fundamental shifted in the architecture of what she was. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed, counted the breaths. Not for calm. She was past the point where calm was a realistic aspiration, but for continuity. Because the counting gave her a thread back to herself, to the version of herself that had climbed out of that prison wagon and walked through a border gate and survived 3 weeks in a place designed to kill her, and she needed that thread right now more than she needed anything else. The wings overhead continued their slow circling, patient, waiting. "I don't know how to do this," she said. The words fell into the silence and disappeared. She tried again. Not words this time. She stopped reaching for language and went instead toward the thing itself, the old in the marrow heat of it, and she asked it, in whatever way a person asks something that doesn't have ears, what it needed from her. The answer came back not as instruction, but as image. A single image, brief and total, the way certain memories arrive. Not recalled, but simply present, as though they had always been there just past the edge of what her ordinary attention could reach. A woman standing at the center of a world that was all shadow and light. No soft middle ground between them. A crown that was not metal, but something older. Compressed darkness given structure, shaped by will rather than craft. Around her the same winged creatures circling. Around them, a kingdom that spread in all directions. A realm not built, but grown. Organic and vast and alive in ways that the mortal world's kingdoms were not. The woman's face was not her face, but the posture was. The stillness, the set of the jaw. The image lasted 2 seconds, and then she was back in the valley, in the dark, with the creatures circling above and the ground breathing beneath her. "All right," she said to the tree, to the valley, to whatever was still looking up at her from the dark below the opened earth. "I hear you." She did not say she accepted it. She was not the kind of person who accepted things before she understood them. But she acknowledged what she had seen, and the acknowledgement was enough, apparently because the circling creatures above her shifted. The pattern changed, tighter, lower, a configuration that felt deliberate in the way a formal gesture is deliberate, something performed to be witnessed rather than simply to accomplish a physical end. Then they landed. 1. There were 7 of them. She had the impression of vast size, but not the crushing vastness of the 4-legged creature from the plains. These were vast in the way tall trees are vast, vertically oriented, with a presence that was more about height than about mass. Their wings folded along bodies that were both dark and not dark, a quality that kept eluding her direct attention the way peripheral vision catches things that frontal focus loses. She could see them most clearly when she wasn't trying, which told her something about their physical nature that she filed for later consideration. They arranged themselves in a rough semicircle at the valley's edge, not surrounding her. The configuration left the western end open, deliberate, an arc, not a cage. 6 of them held the arrangement without moving. The 7th walked toward her. It moved differently from the others, where they held the stillness of things that had been still for a very long time. This one carried motion in a way that suggested a different relationship with time. Not urgency, but something that had recently been in contact with urgency and hadn't entirely shed it. It stopped at 10 feet. When it spoke, and she would later struggle to explain this in any terms that didn't sound like madness, it did not speak with sound. It spoke with the same pressure behind sternum method as the voice from beneath the tree, but with more precision, more granularity, as though it had had more practice translating between whatever its native communication method was and something that a human nervous system could receive. 3 weeks, it said. Not words exactly. The shape of the thought, 3 weeks. Yes, she said. Alone. Yes. A pause that felt like assessment rather than uncertainty. Most die in the first 3 days. I'm aware, she said. I met the things that kill them. You stood your ground against the Veth. She assumed the Veth was the 4-legged creature from the plains. I didn't have another option. Everyone who stands before a Veth has another option, it said. The option is to run. Everyone runs. Running didn't seem like it would work. It doesn't, but people run regardless. The body overrides the calculation. Another pause. Longer. You calculated. She thought about that first moment. The 3 seconds between registering the creature's scale and making a decision. She had not, in those 3 seconds, experienced anything she would describe as calm, but the calculating part of her had kept running even while the rest of her was processing the alarm. She hadn't been aware of choosing that. It had simply been what happened. I've been doing that my whole life, she said, calculating when the body wants to react. We know, it said. The simplicity of that, the weight of it, settled on her like the first clear light after a long fog. You've been watching me, she said, since you crossed the border. And before? The longest pause yet. Since before you were born. She took a slow breath in through her nose. The air here at the valley's center tasted different from the rest of the death zone. Not better exactly, but more complete, as though most places were giving her only part of the atmospheric information, and this place was giving her all of it. Then you need to talk, she said, because I've been surviving on 3 weeks of almost nothing, and whatever just happened to me when that ground opened up, and I don't have the luxury of waiting for you to decide I'm ready to hear things. I was ready 3 weeks ago. I'm readier now. Start talking. The creature, she needed a name for it, and she didn't have one, so she settled on the 7th, the one that spoke, made a sound that was its own system's equivalent of something wry, recognition of a particular kind of directness. The Shadow Realm, it said, is not dead. Well, it took most of the night. She sat at the valley's center with the 7th across from her and the other 6 arranged at the edges. And it told her things that reorganized her understanding of her own history in the way major structural changes reorganize a building. Some walls came down, some new weight-bearing elements revealed themselves, and what she'd been living in was still recognizable, but had become something different in its fundamentals. The Shadow Realm had been a kingdom, not a metaphor, not a legend's approximation of something more complex, a real and functional kingdom, older than the Moonfang Empire by several thousand years, which itself was not young. Its rulers had been of a bloodline that existed at the intersection of the mortal world, and something else, something older and harder to name, a layer of existence that the mortal world scholarship had variously called the deep dark, the underside of the world, or simply the void, none of which captured it accurately. The Shadow Realm's rulers had not been conquerors. They had been, as far as she could understand through the 7th's translation of concepts that didn't have clean mortal equivalents, managers of a boundary. The place between the mortal world and what lay below it needed governance, not military governance, not the domination-based power structures that the Moonfang Empire ran on, but something more like maintenance, Someone had to hold the membrane between worlds intact, had to manage the things that wanted to cross it, had to keep the darkness that was simply the deep nature of certain ancient forces from becoming the darkness that destroyed things it came into contact with. The Shadow Realm's bloodline had done this for thousands of years, until the Civil War. She had heard the Civil War mentioned in her bloodline tutor's curriculum, briefly, obliquely, the kind of historical reference that exists in texts primarily to explain why certain bloodlines no longer appear in the current era genealogical records. What the tutor had presented as a minor conflict between ancient houses turned out, through the Seventh's account, to have been something significantly larger, a deliberate destruction. Not a war between factions with competing interests, but a coordinated effort by certain mortal world powers who had decided that the Shadow Realm's existence was a threat to their own autonomy, that the boundary managers had too much inherent power and needed to be removed. They didn't just destroy the kingdom, she said. No, the Seventh agreed. They destroyed the bloodline. They tried. She looked at her own hands. In the valley's strange, not light, they looked the same as they always had. Her hands. The hands she'd grown up looking at, the hands she'd been told carried dormant wolf blood that had simply failed to properly express. They didn't finish. One child survived, carried out of the burning by a servant who loved the family enough to run into the Empire's territory and lie. She gave the child to a minor noble house, told them the child was the result of an affair with an alpha from a traveling pack. The noble house had reasons to believe the story and no reasons to look closely. The Seventh paused. The child grew up, had children. The bloodline thinned across generations. The memory was lost. But the blood wasn't. The blood, the Seventh said, with a quality that she recognized now as something close to satisfaction, is impossible to lose. It only goes dormant. It waits for the right conditions. She thought about 22 years of being told her wolf hadn't awakened, of healer after healer confirming what the official record said. No secondary form, no wolf spirit, a fundamental biological failure. Of watching other wolves her age shift for the first time, the involuntary shift of early adolescence, and feeling nothing move inside her except a growing understanding of what it meant to be the wrong kind of thing in a world that had very specific ideas about which kinds were acceptable. It wasn't dormant, she said slowly. It was different, and they couldn't read different. They couldn't read it because they had spent 2,000 years making sure nobody could. The knowledge that would have told a healer what to look for was systematically removed from the Empire's scholarship. The Seventh held its position with the settled quality of something that had been waiting to say these things for a long time. Everything that existed in their records about the Shadow Realm's bloodline was replaced with one phrase. She already knew what the phrase was. She'd seen it in her own documentation. Awakening failure. Awakening failure. She sat with that for a long moment. 30 seconds of very quiet. Then she said, "The people who did this to my bloodline, who destroyed the kingdom and rewrote the records, are they still operating?" The Seventh's posture shifted. Their descendants are. In the Empire. At the highest levels of the Empire. A pause waited with implications. Close to the throne. She thought about Lord Vance Crestholt, about Lady Seraphine Duval's falsified healer's attestation, about old Marquis Alderin Voss and his patient smile at the tribunal. The patience of a man who already knows the outcome because he built the outcome 3 generations ago. "They framed me," she said. Not a question. "They manufactured a reason for the king to exile you, the same way their ancestors manufactured reasons to destroy your bloodline's kingdom. Different tools, same objective." The Seventh's presence in the air between them had a quality she could only describe as gravity. Not physical weight, but the weight of truth that has been held in waiting for longer than it should have been. You were becoming something they couldn't control, even suppressed, even with your bloodline's properties hidden behind a misdiagnosis. You were drawn to the boundary. You kept going to the border territories. You kept asking questions about the death zone that a wolf with no interest in it should not have been asking. She remembered that. Age 15, she had gone to the palace library and requested every text available on the death zone's history. The head librarian had looked at her with an expression she'd filed under adult condescension at the time, and told her those materials were restricted to authorized research scholars. She had requested the authorization form. She'd been told no form was available for her designation. She had gone back 4 times. The 5th time, the head librarian had reported her request to someone in the council administration. She understood now why that had apparently mattered to them. They saw me pulling toward the boundary, she said, and they accelerated their timeline. Yes. And Darius, she stopped, made herself continue. Darius was the mechanism. The king was not their ally in the conscious sense, the 7th said. With a careful precision she recognized as the difference between condemning someone and accurately describing them. He was their tool. He believed what they told him. They had been managing what he believed since before he ascended to the throne. The falsified records, the healer's attestation. He had no reason to know those things were false. He trusted his counsel the way kings trust councils, when nothing has yet given them reason not to. She heard this and held it, and did what she had trained herself to do with information she didn't want to receive. She held it still and looked at it straight and refused to look away until she had seen it clearly. That doesn't make what he did forgivable. No, the 7th said simply. It doesn't. It makes it comprehensible. The distinction landed in her chest like a stone into water. Comprehensible, not forgivable. Those were 2 different countries, and the 7th was not asking her to cross the border between them. Good, she said. She slept in the valley for 3 days, not because she chose to exactly. Her body decided, in the manner of bodies that have been running on inadequate everything for 3 weeks and have finally found a place that isn't actively trying to kill them. She simply went down one afternoon and didn't come back up until the 3rd morning, waking in stages, each stage of wakefulness revealing something new about how the valley's air worked on a sleeping person. She felt when she was finally fully conscious. The way she imagined a joint felt after a dislocation was corrected. A specific relief that was almost indistinguishable from pain. The relief of something returning to the alignment it was always supposed to have. The 7th was there when she woke, as were 3 of the other 6. She sat up and ate from the pack, nearly empty now, the last strips of dried provisions, and said, "What comes next?" Not a question. A prompt. "The awakening is beginning," the 7th said. "What you felt 3 nights ago, that is not complete. It will take time, and it will require more than this valley." What does it require? The realm itself. You need to walk it, all of it. The blood recognizes the land, and the land recognizes the blood, but the recognition has to be renewed. Your bloodline's connection to this place has been dormant for 2,000 years. It doesn't fully trust that you're real until you've touched enough of it. She looked out at the black plains visible from the valley's edge, the layered dark sky, the distant formations of stone that she had been navigating around for 3 weeks. How large is the death zone? Larger than the Empire. How much larger? 6 times. She absorbed this. And I have to walk all of it. You have to walk enough of it that the realm accepts the connection. The precise amount is not predetermined. It ends when it ends. That's not particularly useful navigation information. No, the 7th agreed. It isn't. She finished the last of the provisions and folded the pack and looked at her hands again. The shaking had stopped sometime during the 3 days of sleep. She turned her palms over and looked at the torn skin from her fall on the 21st day, now healed in the clean way of wounds that have had proper time rather than the ragged closing she'd managed with the cloth strip and the silver-green moss. "I need supplies," she said. "I can't walk 6 times the Empire's territory on 3 days of sleep and an empty pack." The realm provides. She looked at the 7th directly. "I'm going to need you to be more specific than that." It turned out the realm providing was not a metaphor. It was a function, like how a body generates heat when properly fed. Not a conscious action, not a generosity, just a system operating as systems do when their conditions are met. She was the condition that had been missing. With her presence in the valley, with the first stages of the awakening beginning in her blood, the death zone's own ecology had reoriented in ways that made it incrementally more navigable for her specifically. The Black River's water was still not safe in the ordinary sense, but her body had developed over the 3 days of sleep, something that processed it without the illness she'd experienced in the first week. The plants with the iridescent leaves were edible if prepared correctly, which the seventh demonstrated, a method of pressing and heating that released the nutrients while neutralizing whatever the raw form contained that made it wrong for human metabolism. The shapes, the dark entities she'd been navigating around for 3 weeks, began, over the following days, to change their behavior. Not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally. The aggressive ones pulled back further. The passive ones acknowledged her passing. 3 days into her resumed walking, one of the smaller passive shapes, roughly the mass of a large dog, though the shape was not a dog shape in any meaningful anatomical sense, began following her at a distance of 20 feet, not threateningly, just following. She ignored it for half a day. Then she stopped walking and turned around. It stopped when she stopped. They regarded each other. "If you're going to follow me," she said, "you can walk next to me. 20 feet behind is going to drive me insane." The shape hesitated. Then it covered the 20 feet in a movement so fluid it looked like it was made of the darkness itself, flowing across ground rather than a solid thing traversing space. It settled at her left side at approximately knee height. She looked down at it. It looked up at whatever its equivalent of looking was. "All right," she said, and kept walking. She named it something she never told anyone, kept entirely inside her head, a small, private thing in a place that had stripped her of almost everything private. It stayed at her side through the rest of that day and was still there when she woke the next morning, folded at the edge of her camp in the stillness of something accustomed to waiting. The seventh appeared intermittently, not always physically present, but reachable, accessible through the same pressure behind sternum sense. She was developing the ability to initiate rather than only receive. She asked questions. The seventh answered them with varying degrees of completeness, which she recognized as not evasiveness, but accuracy. Some things it knew fully, some things it knew partially, and it distinguished between those categories rather than filling gaps with confident-sounding approximation. "The corruption in this mortal world," she said one evening, camped on a high plateau with a view of the death zone's interior that went further than she could find the edge of. "The thing that's infecting the Empire's territories, that's connected to this place, the corruption is what happens when the boundary is unmanaged," the seventh said. "The realm needs a ruler who maintains the membrane between worlds. Without that, pressure builds from the other side. Things push through that shouldn't be in the mortal world. The corruption is the physical effect of that pressure on mortal world matter. It will spread." "How fast?" "It has been spreading for 2,000 years. Slowly, because the blood's dormancy retains some passive maintenance function. But as the awakening progresses, it will accelerate," she said. "Yes, because the dormancy is ending. The passive maintenance function is transitioning into something active and directional, which means the boundary will get worse before it gets better." She looked at the vast, dark horizon. "The empire I was exiled from is going to suffer while I'm out here learning to be what I apparently am." "Yes. People are going to die. Some have already died. More will." She sat with that. It was not a comfortable thing to sit with. The people dying in the empire were not, for the most part, the people who had put her in chains and read a decree over a crowd of thousands. They were ordinary wolves living ordinary lives in the merchant quarter and the craftsman's district and the eastern residential neighborhoods. The boy on the market stall who had pointed at her wagon. "There's no way to accelerate my timeline," she said. "What this place needs from me requires the time it requires." "Yes." "Then I can't spend energy grieving the people dying while I learn." She paused. "But I'm going to remember them." "That is the difference," the seventh said quietly, "between a ruler and a king." She looked at it. "Explain." "A king consolidates power and protects the kingdom as an expression of the power. A ruler accepts the cost of governance as a debt owed to those governed. Its presence in the air between them had that gravity quality again. The kings who ordered your bloodline's destruction were afraid of Shadow Realm rulers because rulers are ungovernable by the ordinary mechanisms of fear and appetite that keep most powerful beings manageable. You cannot threaten what someone is willing to lose. You cannot buy what someone has already chosen to give." She thought about Darius, about the way he had been managed by his council, through his need for their validation, his assumption of their loyalty, his belief in the institutional structures they controlled, the mechanisms of fear and appetite. She thought about what she had walked away from, not chosen to lose, had taken from her. But walking away and having something taken could end up in the same place if you decided to let them. I need to move faster, she said. Not recklessly, but I need to move faster. The weeks that followed had a different quality from the first 3. She was not surviving anymore. She was in some way she didn't have complete language for, working. The walking was purposeful in ways that went beyond the physical. There were places in the death zone where the awakening accelerated, where the blood recognized something specific in the land, and the unspooling inside her moved faster, and the world looked briefly different, like someone had shifted the light source to reveal the underlying structure. She started to trust those moments and move toward them rather than cataloging them as anomalies. The small dark shape at her knee became a fixture. More shapes joined it over the following week. Not threatening, not aggressive, simply present in the way of things that had been waiting for something to orient around. By the 6th week, she was walking with a loose configuration of 15 or 20 of them, none making sound, none requiring direction, operating with the instinctive coherence of a pack that had already agreed on its hierarchy and didn't need to discuss it. She thought about what that meant, about what she was becoming. There is a particular psychological event that happens to people who survive what they were not supposed to survive, and it is not, as the popular imagination tends to assume, a triumph. It is more like a recalibration, the organism updating its model of itself based on evidence. Before the exile, her self-model had been structured around the Empire's assessment of her. The awakening failure, the cursed girl, the Omega who couldn't do the one thing Omegas were supposed to do. She had fought that model, had argued against it internally and occasionally externally, but fighting a model is not the same as replacing it, and the model had persisted at some level below conscious rejection. Now, walking the death zone with something old and powerful unspooling further through her blood every day, with creatures of ancient lineage orienting around her movements, with the land itself responding to her presence, the model was being replaced not by argument but by evidence, by reality asserting itself. This was not comfortable. Comfort is what happens when the model matches reality. What happened here was more like the productive discomfort of growth, of something being rebuilt to a different specification than it started from. She had been told her whole life that she was not what she was. She was in the process of becoming it anyway. That was not triumph. That was a kind of ongoing work that didn't have a clean endpoint, but it was honest, and in a life that had been shaped by institutional dishonesty, falsified records, manipulated kings, systematic erasure, honesty had a value that transcended comfort. On the 43rd day, the message came. She had made camp in a section of the death zone where the terrain became architectural. Massive formations of what appeared to be solidified shadow, vertical columns that rose 80, 100 feet and cast deeper darkness than the surrounding darkness, arranged in configurations that suggested intention. She had been drawn here by the same pull that led her toward the areas where the awakening accelerated, and the area had delivered. 2 days in this place had moved the internal unspooling further than the previous 2 weeks combined. She was sitting at the base of one of the columns, the small, original dark shape pressed against her left leg, when the pressure in the sternum fired with an intensity she hadn't felt since the valley. Not the 7th reaching out, she had developed enough sensitivity to distinguish the 7th's particular frequency from others. This was different. Foreign. It came from the mortal world's direction. She sat up straight and opened whatever the sense was that she was developing. There was no clean word for it, but it operated like listening, if listening could be directed at sources beyond the range of audible sound. It was not a voice. It was a state of being, transmitted across the boundary in the way extreme emotions sometimes translated through mate bonds in ways that cross distances they shouldn't be able to cross. Fear. Urgent, sustained, systemic fear of the kind that meant not personal danger but wide-scale collapse. And underneath the fear, something she hadn't expected to feel crossing that boundary. Guilt. His guilt. Darius. She cut the connection before it could go further, slammed the sense shut the way you slam a window in a storm. Not graceful, not measured, a purely reflexive self-protective response. The shape at her knee startled, pressed closer against her leg. She sat very still and breathed. He was afraid. The Empire was falling apart, and he was afraid, and whatever he had learned, she didn't know what he had learned, she had cut the connection too fast, was weighing on him with the specific heaviness of guilt rather than ordinary fear. She had not expected to feel his emotional state. She had been operating on the assumption that the mate bond he had rejected at the exile was gone, severed by the decree and the chain and the looking away. She understood now that was not how mate bonds worked. You could reject the person. You could not reject the bond. What you could do was what she did next. She rebuilt the wall around it stone by stone in the architectural metaphor her mind had defaulted to for managing the connection, made the wall thick enough that his fear would not reach her unless she actively chose to listen for it, made the wall high enough that the guilt, his guilt, carrying the specific shape of his guilt, which had a texture she recognized because she had carried versions of it herself, would not bleed through in the dark hours. And then she sat with the fact of what she'd felt. The Empire was falling, not gradually, not in the slow measured way of institutional decline. The fear she'd felt in those 2 seconds of connection was the fear of something falling quickly, of a person who has realized that the floor is not where they expected it to be. She looked at the dark shape against her leg, at the column of solidified shadow overhead, at the open expanse of the death zone stretching in all directions, immense and dark and increasingly known to her. She was 43 days in, 43 days stronger, more certain, more herself than she had been on the day they put chains on her wrists on that platform above a crowd of thousands. She was also not ready. Whatever the awakening needed from her was not complete. She could feel the incompleteness of it. The unspooling had gone further, but not to its end. The land's recognition was partial rather than total. The things she was becoming required more of the work she'd been doing before they resolved into something stable. She was not ready. But the Empire, the people in the merchant quarter, and the craftsman's district, the boy on the market stall, the ordinary wolves in their ordinary houses, they could not wait for her to be ready. This was the weight of governance that the seventh had described, the debt owed to those governed. It was not abstract. It was this, the conflict between what you needed and what the people depending on your existence needed, and the choice between serving yourself and serving the thing that made yourself worth anything in the first place. She did not make the decision immediately. She sat with it through the night, one of those nights where the death zone's layered sky did something extraordinary above her, a movement through the depths of it, vast and slow, creatures she still hadn't found the language for engaging in behaviors she could observe but not interpret, the darkness performing its own version of beauty in a key that human aesthetics had never been built to receive. She sat with it and did not decide. And in the morning, the seventh appeared. Not alone. The valley's full complement, all seven, together, for the first time since her third day, stood at the camp's edge as the death zone's false dawn moved through its color shifts, and the seventh faced her with a posture that had changed from all the previous interactions. Something resolved in it, something that had been waiting and had stopped waiting. "You know what's happening in the mortal world," it said. "I felt it. His fear." She stood up and brushed the black soil from her clothes. "The boundary deterioration is accelerating." "Yes." "How bad?" "Entire cities are losing the light," the seventh said. "The corruption has reached the capital district. If it breaches the city's central bloodline wards, the wards will fail. The wards will fail." She looked at all seven of them. At the shapes arranged behind her, 30-odd now, the number had grown while she wasn't tracking it. At the vast, dark, alive kingdom that had been waiting 2,000 years for her to come home to it. "I'm not complete," she said. "The awakening is as complete as it can be from here," the seventh said. "The last of what you need cannot happen in the death zone. It has to happen at the boundary itself, at the place where both realms touch." She understood what that meant. "I'd be going back." "Yes. To the empire that exiled me. To the boundary where your realm and the mortal world meet. The empire happens to be on the other side of it." She almost laughed. "That's a very careful way of phrasing it." "You are not going back to the empire," the seventh said, with a precision that felt important enough to make slowly. "You are not returning to the place that discarded you, seeking restoration of what they took. You are going to the boundary to do the work that only the heir of the Shadow Realm can do. The empire is in the way." The distinction landed. She was not going back to be judged again, to be evaluated by the metrics of a system that had never been built to see what she was. She was going to a place where the work needed to be done. The people who happened to live there could observe or not observe, could evaluate or not evaluate. It didn't particularly matter what they thought. The Queen of the Shadow Realm did not require their assessment. She shouldered the pack, replenished now by the realm providing, stuffed with things that had no mortal world names but functioned as food and water and tools, and looked east, which was also west, which was also the direction of the border compound, and the military road, and 43 days of walking unwound in whatever time it would take to re-walk it. The things that came with me, she said. The shapes behind her. The winged creatures. The Veth she had stood down on the plains. They follow me out? They follow you everywhere now, the seventh said. That is what following means when the realm has chosen a ruler. She looked back at them. At the 30-odd shapes, at the winged seven behind her, at the vast dark landscape full of ancient things that had been waiting for a direction. Then we move, she said. She had taken 7 steps toward the border when the seventh spoke once more. The king will feel you coming, it said. The bond doesn't lie. He'll know something is moving toward the Empire, something unlike anything he's ever encountered. She didn't stop walking. Good, she said. And the death zone moved with her, not metaphorically, not as narrative decoration, but physically, measurably, the landscape shifting behind and around her as she walked, the realm itself responding to its queen's direction the way a vast organism responds to a signal from its central system. The darkness folded and gathered. The winged shapes launched overhead. The ground darkened further in the 30 feet around her as though it was maintaining contact with her boots. She was halfway to the border when she felt it. Not Darius's fear this time. Not the guilt she'd been keeping walled out. Something from beneath the Empire. Deep beneath, deeper than the corruption's surface manifestations, deeper than the capital's bloodline wards or the city's foundations or the bedrock that the city's foundations rested on. Something that had been imprisoned below the mortal world for 2,000 years. Something that had been waiting for the boundary to weaken enough. Something that was no longer waiting. The ground beneath the entire empire, 1,000 miles away, and she felt it in her feet through the death zone's floor, as clearly as if she were standing on it, shifted, and then cracked, and from the crack, something came up. She broke into a run. She ran. Not the desperate running of someone fleeing, the purposeful running of someone moving toward a problem before the problem finishes defining itself. The death zone's terrain was familiar now in ways it hadn't been on day one, and her body had learned the language of it, where the ground held, where it didn't, which formations required deviation and which could be crossed directly. She covered ground in the dark at a speed that would have been impossible 6 weeks ago, the small shape keeping pace at her left, the larger winged forms overhead adjusting their pattern to match her movement. The crack she'd felt through the death zone's floor had lasted 3 seconds. Then it stopped. Not resolved. Stopped. The way a sound stops when the thing making it realizes it has been heard. She kept running. The seventh appeared at her right without transitioning from anywhere, simply present where it hadn't been, which she had stopped flagging as alarming 3 weeks ago. What came through, she said. Not asking whether something came through, she had felt it. Not a what? The seventh said, matching her pace in the fluid way of its kind. A who? She processed that without breaking stride. The imprisoned one, from below the Empire. The one your bloodline's kingdom was built to contain. A pause that carried weight. He has been pressing against the boundary for 2,000 years. The deterioration gave him a seam. He used it. Is he fully through? No. A fraction, an extension of himself, enough to accelerate the corruption significantly, enough to begin destabilizing the Empire's foundational bloodline architecture from the inside. She thought about what that meant for the capital's wards, for the city's foundations, for the hundreds of thousands of ordinary wolves who had no idea what was pressing up through the ground beneath their streets. How long before the extension becomes a full breach? If the boundary continues deteriorating at its current rate, 10 days, perhaps 12. She calculated. The border compound was 11 days' walk from where she currently was if she maintained today's pace. I can make the border in 8 if I push. The terrain between your current position and the border is not the terrain you crossed coming in. the seventh said. You went through the northern approach. The direct route is through the hollow. She looked at it. What's in the hollow? Things older than what you've encountered, things that have not yet assessed you. Will they attack? Unknown. She kept running. Then we go through the hollow and find out. The hollow was a depression in the Death Zone's landscape, roughly 20 miles across, set below the surrounding terrain like a wound that had never fully closed. The air above it moved differently. Not the Death Zone's standard wrongness, but a concentrated version. The wrongness turned inward and intensified by the bowl shape that kept it from dispersing. Standing at its edge and looking down, she could see nothing clearly. The darkness in the hollow was the type she'd observed in the depth center of the tree's valley, but without the valley's quality of rightness to counterbalance it. This was simply depth, darkness that had been folding in on itself for long enough to develop a gravitational quality. The shapes behind her stopped at the rim. All of them. She turned and looked at the 30-odd entities that had been following her without hesitation for 2 weeks, and every single one of them had stopped at a line as clean as if it had been drawn. The small original shape was pressing close to her ankle, not with the casual contact of its usual proximity, but with pressure. An opinion. They don't go in, she said. The hollow predates the realm's current organization, the seventh said. What lives in it does not operate under the realm's authority. But it operates under mine. That is the question the hollow will answer. She looked down into the depth. She thought about 10 days, about the crack in the ground beneath the Empire, about the ordinary wolves who had never done anything to her and who were going to die in the dark if the boundary failed completely. She stepped over the rim. The shapes didn't follow. The seventh did. The descent was not physically difficult. The slope was gradual, the footing manageable, but the air changed within the first 50 feet in ways that were not atmospheric. The pressure she'd been navigating for weeks, the weight of the Death Zone's standard wrongness, that was gone, replaced by something that had no pressure at all. An absence. As though the hollow existed in a pocket where the usual rules of what the air was supposed to do simply didn't apply, and the air had accepted this with equanimity. She breathed it in and her chest expanded further than it should have. At 100 feet below the rim, she could no longer see the rim. The darkness above was the same as the darkness below and on all sides. Not directional, not oriented. The kind of darkness that made orientation a concept you had to construct, rather than a quality of the space you were in. She kept a mental map running from the rim point and the angle of her descent, and the number of steps, which was imprecise but better than nothing. She walked for 40 minutes and encountered nothing. The nothing was not empty. It had a quality. The hollow was attended. She could feel attention the way she'd learned to feel it in the Death Zone. The difference between space that was simply space and space that was being watched. This space was being watched with a specificity that made the shape's observation feel casual by comparison. She stopped walking. I know you're here, she said. I don't know what you are or what this place means to you, but I'm moving through it because the boundary between this realm and the mortal world is failing, and there's something pressing through it that's going to kill a lot of people, and I'm the one who can stop it. So whatever assessment you need to do it fast. The darkness compressed. Not literally. The space didn't physically change, but the quality of the attention focused down to a single point directly in front of her. And from that point, something extended outward that she felt against her skin as temperature dropped and against her blood, as the unspooling thing inside her responding to a challenge it recognized before she consciously did. It pressed against her, not physically. It pressed against her identity, against the thing she was becoming, testing it the way you test a blade's temper, pressing until either the metal holds or it doesn't. She stood still and let it press. There is a thing that happens to people who have been tested long enough and hard enough that the testing itself becomes information rather than ordeal. Aurelia had reached that place somewhere around day 30, the point where difficulty stopped being a signal that she should stop and became simply data about the environment. What the hollow was doing to her was a more fundamental version of the same thing. It wasn't testing her endurance. It was testing what she was made of at a level below endurance, below will, below even the conscious self that makes decisions and narrates its own survival. She held. The pressure withdrew. From the darkness directly ahead, something moved. Not the shapes she'd been traveling with, not the winged creatures. Something the hollow had been keeping that had never been outside the hollow. She understood this instinctively, the same way she understood that a particular path was safe or not safe before her analytical mind had finished processing the sensory information. It was the size of the seventh. It moved with the stillness of great age. When it reached her, when it was close enough that she could feel the temperature of it, cold in a way that wasn't cold but was the absence of the warmth that living things generate, it stopped. It put something against her chest, not a hand, not a physical appendage, in any sense she had vocabulary for. Something that didn't have a name in any language she knew. The unspooling inside her lurched forward. In 3 seconds, she felt more of the awakening complete than in the previous week combined. It was not comfortable. It was the physiological reorganization again, magnified. Every nerve she had firing simultaneously, her blood moving faster, the world around her becoming simultaneously more and less visible as whatever her perception was becoming reorganized itself toward a different specification. When it withdrew the touch, she was on one knee. Not from weakness, from the automatic motor response to a system shock that magnitude. She got up. She was in the hollow's darkness, and she could see it. Not see through it, see it the way you see a material, the way you see the grain in wood or the weave in fabric. The darkness had texture now, structure. She could navigate by it the way she'd previously navigated by light. The seventh, beside her, made a sound she hadn't heard from it before. "What?" she said. "Your eyes," it said. She touched her face reflexively, felt nothing different at her fingertips. "What about them?" "They're silver now, not wolf silver, shadow silver, the old color." A pause with the weight of something long awaited in it. "The bloodline's color." She took that in, filed it, kept walking. The hollow led her through. Done. She crossed the border compound on the 8th day. The soldiers stationed there saw her coming when she was still half a mile out, which gave them time to decide what to do. She could tell, from the way the watchtower's activity changed at that distance, that they were deciding something they hadn't been trained to decide. Their protocol covered wolves trying to cross back from the death zone, a theoretical scenario historically, given that no one had ever returned. It did not cover a woman crossing back in the dark with 30 shadow entities behind her, and 7 winged shapes overhead, and something in her bearing that apparently communicated clearly enough that 3 of the 8 soldiers on duty put down their weapons before she reached the compound's outer wall. The gates opened. Not on order. 2 of the soldiers simply opened them. She walked through. The captain on duty was not Corden, someone else, younger, with the look of a man who had prepared for many professional situations and was now confronting one that wasn't on the list. He stood in the compound's center yard and watched her approach, and said nothing until she stopped 10 feet from him. "You're—" He stopped, started again. "You're Aurelia Nightthorn." "Yes." He looked at her eyes, at the shapes behind her, at the sky, looked back at her face. "You're supposed to be dead." "People keep underestimating the death zone's opinions about what I'm supposed to be," she said. "I need a horse, and whatever intelligence you have on the corruption spread in the capital district. I'll take the horse if you don't have the intelligence, but I'd prefer both." The captain stared at her for 5 seconds that she let him have because the situation warranted it. "The corruption," he said slowly, "hit the eastern residential district 4 days ago. The central bloodline wards are holding, but the king has had 3 emergency council sessions in the last week, and there are reports of—" He stopped, seemed to decide something, continued. "Entire blocks going dark. Not fire dark. The other kind." She knew the other kind, the boundary breach kind. How close to the city center? Close enough that they moved the secondary council chambers to the palace's interior. He held her gaze with the expression of someone choosing to be functional over being appropriately overwhelmed. The king's been in military command of the response himself, sleeping 4 hours a night if that. "Horse," she said. He got her a horse. About that. She rode through the night and the following day and arrived at the capital's eastern gate in the gray false morning of the second day, and the city was not the city she had left 8 months ago. The eastern gate itself was intact, but the air on this side of it had the qualities she recognized from the death zone's deterioration zones. That metallic edge, that pressure at the sinuses, the sense of space that was being compressed by something pushing from the wrong direction. The merchant district's outer streets were quiet in the way of streets where the population has made an internal calculation about risk, and decided the calculation doesn't favor being outside. Shuttered windows, closed market stalls. Twice she passed blocks where the darkness she'd learned to navigate by in the hollow was present in the mortal world's daylight hours, visible shadow in places where architecture or time of day didn't account for it, spreading from the ground up the walls of buildings the way water spreads from a leak. The shapes did not come with her through the gate. They stopped at the wall, not because she told them to, but because the mortal world's architecture was not yet calibrated for them, and they understood this in their own way and stayed at the periphery. The Winged Seven were still overhead, high enough that from the street level they'd register as large birds at unusual altitude if anyone was looking. The palace's outer approach was guarded by 4 times the normal complement, which told her the military was scared. Scared soldiers overpopulate fixed positions because movement feels like vulnerability, and fixed positions feel like control, even when the thing threatening you moves through the ground beneath the fixed position. She rode up to the checkpoint without slowing to the expected pace. The guard captain raised his hand. "State your name and—" "Aurelia Nightthorn," she said. "Tell King Darius she's here. Don't make me repeat it." The words went through the checkpoint the way certain words go through groups of people. Not passed along but transmitted, replicating faster than the individual mouths saying them. She watched the captain's face process her name, and then process her eyes, and then arrive at a place that was past denial and into something operational. He sent a runner. She waited on the horse without dismounting, which was a choice. They brought her inside, not to the throne room, to the War Council chamber, which was in the palace's interior, as the border captain had said. The route there took her through corridors she had walked hundreds of times in her former life, and they were the same corridors, same stone, same torches, same architectural choices made by dead kings 2 centuries prior. But the people in them looked at her with expressions that had no clean category. She recognized the faces of servants who had known her as a ward of the palace. She recognized 2 junior council members who had been at the tribunal. None of them stopped her. The War Council chamber was a circular room with maps covering 2 of the walls and a long table at the center covered in documents and the remnants of what had clearly been a very long night's work. 5 people were in it when she entered. Lord Vance Crestholt, Lady Seraphine Duval, General Roe Thornwick, 2 advisors she recognized from the tribunal's observer section, and Darius. He was standing at the map wall with his back to the door, tracing something on the Eastern District overlay with 2 fingers. He was in working clothes rather than regalia, dark wool, the kind of practical clothing a king wears when he's been running on 4 hours of sleep for weeks, and the audience for his appearance is a war council rather than a public ceremony. His shoulders were carrying weight that she could see from across the room. He heard her enter. She knew he heard her. The slight arrest of his fingers' movement on the map told her. But he finished the trace he'd started before turning. Then he turned. Whatever he had prepared himself for, whatever image he'd constructed in the seconds between the runner's message and this moment, was not sufficient. She watched his face move through several things in rapid succession. Shock, then something under the shock that was more complex, and then the snap of the king's face back over the more complex thing, because there were other people in this room, and he was still a king regardless of what was happening in his chest. "Leave us," he said to the room. His voice was flat and even and completely controlled. Crestholt didn't move. "Your Majesty, this is not the appropriate—" "Leave," Darius said, and the word had a frequency in it that was pure alpha, stripped of all the governance layers and court protocol, the raw biological authority of a dominant wolf who was not asking, and Crestholt moved. They all moved. The door closed. She and Darius were alone in the room for the first time since she had been 12 years old, and they had sat in a library together arguing about bloodline law, and neither of them said anything for a moment that lasted longer than it needed to. He looked at her eyes first. She watched him register the silver and process it without having a category for what it meant. "You're alive," he said. "Yes." "How long?" 8 months? 4 days. She paused. "Give or take a day. I wasn't keeping precise count." He looked at her eyes again, at the shape of her, the posture, the stillness she was holding herself in that was not the stillness of restraint, but the stillness of something that had settled into its own gravity. "What happened to you?" he said. not a demand. Something rawer than a demand. What happened to me is a longer conversation than we have time for, she said. The boundary beneath your capital is failing. Something is pressing through it from below. I can stop it, but I need information about the corruption's current spread, and I need access to the palace's lower levels, specifically the Foundation bloodline chambers. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something they had been certain was gone and have found returned in a form that is both recognizable and entirely different. The Foundation chambers are sealed, I know. I need them unsealed. Aurelia, I know what's under your city, Darius. She said his name the way she had said it on the platform, the way that was native to her mouth. I know what it is, and I know what it's trying to do, and I know why it's trying to do it now when it never could before. I need access to the chambers, and I need the council out of my way while I work. He stared at her. The council, she said carefully, keeping the temperature of the words precisely calibrated because she needed to be heard rather than dismissed, is not your ally. 3 of the 5 people who just left this room have been managing the story of your kingdom to serve an agenda that predates your reign and will outlast it unless you stop them. The corruption isn't just a boundary problem. It's being facilitated. Someone is keeping the bloodline wards fractionally below full effectiveness, not destroying them, maintaining them at a level that looks like deterioration but is actually manipulation. The silence was different this time. That's an extraordinary accusation, he said. Yes, she said. It is. I know it's an extraordinary accusation. She reached into her pack and put 3 items on the War Council table. Documents, not the mortal world's paper, but something the Death Zone's realm produced, materials that held information in a form more durable than ink on parchment. The 7th had provided them on the 2nd day of her return journey, in the careful manner of someone who had been waiting for the right time to hand over evidence that had been gathered across centuries. The Crestholt bloodline's original charter, she said, pointing to the first, from 2,000 years ago, before they took the Crestholt name. Before they reinvented themselves as loyal nobles of the empire they helped create by destroying the kingdom that came before it. She pointed to the 2nd, the healer's attestation from my tribunal, alongside the actual reading from 3 months earlier that showed my bloodline's properties in full and was suppressed before it reached the palace's medical record system. She pointed to the 3rd, correspondence between Lord Vance's father and the previous king's council master, discussing, and the language is direct enough that you won't need interpretation, the management of the Nightthorn ward's classification to ensure her exile before she reached the age of full bloodline expression. He looked at the documents. He didn't touch them yet. This was the thing about people who hold power and have held it long enough that the power has become their primary method of organizing reality. The moment when evidence contradicts the version of reality the power structure was built on is not simply a moment of information intake. It is a structural event. The evidence isn't arriving into an empty space and filling it with fact. It's arriving into a space that is already full of the decisions made on the basis of the previous information, full of the relationships maintained and the trust extended, and the institutional investments that the previous information justified. To accept the new information requires dismantling the architecture it contradicts. Kings who are also intelligent wolves do not dismantle their internal architecture quickly. She gave him the time. He picked up the 2nd document, the suppressed healer's attestation, and read it. She watched him read it, watched his eyes move across the material, watched them stop and go back and stop again. Watched his jaw set with the particular tightness of a man holding his face in position while something he didn't invite happens to his chest. He put it down and picked up the correspondence. He read that too. When he finished, he set it on the table with a precision that was the motor expression of the thing he was managing internally. Controlled, deliberate, the opposite of what he probably wanted to do with his hands. How long have you had these? He said. They were gathered over 2,000 years, she said. I've had them since the journey back. 8 days. And you came here? To stop the boundary from failing, that's the primary reason I came. She held his gaze. You're secondary. I want you to understand that, not because of what happened on the platform, though that happened and it happened the way it happened, but because the kingdom failing means people dying, and that can't wait for us to sort out our personal history. He looked at her for a long time. The king's face had come down from over the complex thing, and she could see it now. Whatever the complex thing was, it didn't have a clean name. It was made of multiple things that didn't mix comfortably. "What do you need from me?" he said. "The Foundation chambers, the council out of operational range while I work, and whatever military resources you have pointed at the Eastern District, corruption sites redeployed to the boundary perimeter. They can't fight it with soldiers, but they can contain the civilian exposure." He nodded once. She picked up the documents from the table. As she moved toward the door, he said, "Aurelia." She stopped. "I believe them," he said. "I need you to know that. I'm not—" He stopped. "I believed everything they told me." She had considered how she would respond to this moment, had run the calculation on the journey back, in the hours of riding through the dark, turning the possibilities over. She had considered saying something that closed the distance between them. She had considered saying something that maintained it. She had considered saying nothing. What she said was this: "I know you believe them. That's the problem, not the solution." She left him with that. Dunton. The Foundation chambers were below the palace's lowest accessible level, reached through a door that required the king's seal and had not been opened in. The duty archivist told her with the particular nervousness of someone being asked to do something unprecedented, 17 years. The air when the door swung inward was cold in the hollow's way. Absence of warmth rather than presence of cold, a temperature that was about what wasn't there. She went down alone. The chambers were old in the way the tree in the valley was old, structured by a logic that predated the palace built above them, predated the empire that built the palace, predated most of the current world's vocabulary for why certain places held the weight they held. The bloodline wards were physical here, not metaphorical. Markings on stone that had been maintained by each generation of the palace's resident bloodlines, renewed and reinforced at intervals the archivist had described as increasingly irregular in recent years. She could see them clearly with her shadow-silver eyes. She could also see what had been done to them, not destruction. Crestholt's faction hadn't been destroying the wards. They'd been carving into them, with tools that left marks no mortal world examination would register as intentional, making tiny, precise alterations to the ward architecture that reduced their effective radius by increments small enough to look like ordinary deterioration. The work of decades. The work of people who understood enough about the ward's function to undermine them without triggering the alarm systems built into the wards themselves, because the alarms assumed external attack and the manipulation was coming from within. This was what organizational betrayal actually looked like. Not dramatic treachery, patient, incremental, designed to be invisible. The accumulation of small corruptions, each defensible in isolation, adding up over time to a catastrophe that arrived looking like bad luck and institutional failure rather than deliberate action. She pressed her palm to the first compromised ward and felt the connection establish. Her bloodline's connection to the ward architecture. The connection that predated the empire, predated the wards themselves, running along channels cut 2,000 years ago when the Shadow Realm's ruling line had set the foundations of what the boundary needed to stay stable. She began to work. An hour in, she heard the footsteps on the stairs. Not Darius. She would have recognized his pattern. 3 sets of footsteps, moving with the efficiency of people who had decided something and were implementing it. She kept her palms on the ward and turned her head. Crestholt came in first, Duval behind him, Thornwick at the rear with his hand on his blade. Crestholt looked at her hands on the ward and at her eyes, and whatever uncertainty he might have maintained in the War Council chamber was gone from his face. He looked at her the way people look at things they have decided to stop managing and begin eliminating. "Step away from the ward," he said. "No," she said. "Lord Vance." Duval's voice from behind him had a precision that suggested she had run this situation in advance and prepared her lines. "The protocol is clear. She's an exile engaging with restricted palace infrastructure. Unauthorized access to the Foundation chambers is a capital offense." "Convenient," Aurelia said, without moving her hands. "Given that the unauthorized access I'm currently engaged in is repairing what you spent 30 years breaking." Crestholt's face didn't change. Trained, she noted. Long practice at keeping the surface controlled when the content below it was not. "You have evidence," he said, "that's inadmissible. Materials from the Death Zone have no standing in the Empire's legal framework. The king is under significant stress and is not functioning from clear judgment. We have a responsibility. To whom? She said. He stopped. You keep using the word responsibility, she said. I'm asking you to complete the sentence. Responsibility to whom? Not to the city that's going dark block by block. Not to the boundary that's failing because of what you've been doing to these wards. Not to the empire you've been cannibalizing for 2,000 years. She felt the ward under her palms respond to her blood, the channel deepening, the connection strengthening. So to whom? Step away from the ward, he said again. His voice had flattened. The conversation register was over. Thornwick's blade came out, and something changed in the air of the Foundation chamber that had nothing to do with the three people who had just entered it. The boundary was beneath them. Literally, she could feel it through the stone floor, through the ward channel, through the connection she had spent 8 months becoming capable of sustaining. And below the boundary, in the space between the mortal world and what lay beyond it, the thing that had pressed through the crack 3 days ago was pressing harder. The crack widened. She felt it like a physical blow, a concussive quality in the air, a compression and then expansion that made the stone around them groan in a register too low for human ears, but not too low for wolf hearing. Crestholt looked at the ceiling. The blade in Thornwick's hand was shaking, because the darkness was coming in from the floor, not the shadow dark she moved through and navigated by. This was the other kind, the corruption dark, the boundary breach dark, the light-swallowing, spreading darkness that had been eating the Eastern District block by block, and was now, in this chamber at the palace's foundation, finding the weakened wards and pushing through them. It came up from the stone in threads at first, then sheets, moving toward the three figures near the door with the non-directional purposefulness of something that didn't see individuals, only matter that was in its way. Duval made a sound. Thornwick stepped back. Crestholt stood his ground, which surprised her. She filed it under he's more afraid of failing his objective than of dying, which told her something significant about the structure of what had been running him. If you want to live through the next 4 minutes, she said, her palms still flat against the ward, you will get out of this chamber, all 3 of you. You can't stop it, Crestholt said. You don't have enough of the awakening yet. I know the Bloodline's timeline. We've been tracking it for generations. You're incomplete. Yes, she said. I am. She looked at the darkness threading up from the floor, at the ward channels she'd been repairing, at the connection running through her blood and into the stone, and she made a calculation. The ward, partially repaired, was not strong enough to hold the breakthrough alone. Her bloodline connection, partially awakened, was not strong enough to manage the boundary alone. But the thing pressing through the boundary was not fully through. The extension of it, the fraction the 7th had described, was what was doing this. And the extension, unlike the full entity it was a part of, had exposed itself by pushing at the weakened ward directly. It had reached for the ward to break it, which meant it was touching the ward, which meant she could reach it through the ward. She pushed every channel she had, every open connection, every hour of the Death Zone's work, every degree of the awakening, every thread of her bloodline's ancient and specific authority over the boundary, down through the ward and into the thing touching it. The Foundation chamber shook. The corruption dark convulsed. The thing below the boundary screamed in a frequency that had no sound, but registered as simultaneous structural damage to every ward in the chamber, cracks running up the walls, stone dust from the ceiling. And Crestholt moved, not toward the door, toward her. She couldn't let go of the ward. If she let go, she lost the connection, and the extension completed its breach and everything she'd pushed into the confrontation dissipated. She couldn't defend against a physical approach and maintain the boundary push simultaneously. Crestholt's hand closed around her left arm and pulled. For 5 seconds, she held both, the ward connection and her position, through pure muscular stubbornness and the specific fury of a woman who had survived 8 months of the Death Zone and was not going to be interrupted by a man who had spent 2,000 years choosing wrong sides. But she was one person with 2 hands on a ward and a grip on her arm, and the physics of the situation were not in her favor. He pulled her off the ward. The connection snapped. Below the foundation of the Moonfang Empire's capital palace, the boundary crack split 6 inches wider, and from it, dark and cold and patient as the space between stars, the ancient thing below pressed upward, No longer an extension, no longer a fraction. The full weight of what had been imprisoned beginning its ascent, and the ward channels Aurelia had spent an hour repairing shattered. Every single one, the repaired sections and the broken sections. And the sections Crestholt's 30 years of quiet sabotage had carved into, all of it failing simultaneously. The darkness that came up from the floor was no longer in threads. It was a tide. And standing at its edge, with Crestholt's hand still on her arm, and the three co-conspirators between her and the door, and every ward in the chamber breaking around them, Aurelia understood with the cold precision that had been her survival mechanism since the Death Zone's first night, that there was exactly one thing that might still work. And it was not something the wolf she had been told could do. It was not something the incomplete awakening she was currently carrying could do. It required the full weight of what the Shadow Realm's queen was. Not partial, not suppressed, not managed and incremental, but total. The thing she had been told didn't exist, functioning at the level it was designed to function at. The question was whether she could force the awakening's completion through sheer necessity. The darkness rose. Crestholt, to his credit, let go of her arm, not from any change of allegiance, because the darkness was coming for him too. And self-preservation is a stronger instinct than institutional loyalty in the moment that you can feel the cold of the boundary breach against your skin. And you understand, finally, viscerally, that the abstract power you have been serving for 2,000 years will not step between you and what you helped release. She turned away from all of them. She turned toward the tide. And she made the only choice left. She walked into the tide. Not the way a person walks into something they expect to survive. The way a person walks into something because the only alternative is to stand still and let it take everything behind them. The three conspirators, the chamber, the ward architecture, the palace above it, the city above the palace, the 300,000 ordinary wolves who had never done anything to anyone and were asleep in their beds while the ground beneath them cracked open. You cannot fully explain the decision in the language of heroism. Heroism implies a calculation where sacrifice is weighed against outcome and found acceptable. What Aurelia did walking into that tide was not that. It was more fundamental. The decision of a person who has been stripped of everything optional and finds, at the bottom of the stripping, that what remains is not what they expected, not grief, not rage, something quieter and more absolute. The recognition that this was always going to be what she was for. The darkness hit her, and she did not stop moving. It was cold in the way the hollow had been cold. Absence rather than presence. The cold of something that had not existed in the warmth of the mortal world for 2,000 years and was not yet acclimated to the concept. It pressed against her from all directions simultaneously, seeking the path of least resistance into the material world, which was through anything biological that stood in its path. It found her blood instead of a path. The unspooling thing in her marrow recognized the pressure, the way a locked mechanism recognizes the right key, not with welcome, but with response. Something engaged. The incomplete awakening, which had been running at the level the Death Zone's incremental process had brought it to, was now encountering the exact conditions the Seventh had described as the last stage. The moment where the completion could not happen in the realm itself, but had to happen at the boundary where both worlds touched. It turned out the boundary was here, under the palace floor, in the middle of the corruption tide with the ward channels shattered around her, and a 2,000-year-old imprisoned entity pushing its weight through a 6-inch crack in the membrane between worlds. The awakening lurched. She went down on both knees, not from the pain, though the pain was real, the physiological reorganization running at a speed and magnitude that made the Hollow's version feel like preparation. She went down because her nervous system was doing two things simultaneously that required her body's full computational resources, and locomotion was the first thing to get dropped. Maintaining position against the tide's physical pressure. Sustaining the connection to the boundary through her blood, through the ward architecture that was broken, but not gone. The channels were cracked, not erased, the way a river doesn't stop being a river when its banks break. She pressed her palms to the chamber floor. The stone was cold. Real, physical cold of the boundary breach, frost forming on the surface in patterns that had no meteorological cause. She pushed down through it. Behind her, she heard Darius. He had come down the stairs at a speed that told her someone had told him what was happening, either the archivist or one of the three conspirators calculating that their safest option was to get the king involved. She did not turn around. She heard him stop at the chamber entrance, heard his breath change, the registered shock of seeing the darkness filling the room, the frost on the walls, her kneeling in the center of it with her palms against the floor. Then she heard him take a step into the chamber. "Don't," she said. Not loudly. She didn't have the respiratory capacity for volume right now, but clearly enough. He stopped. "It will go through you," she said. "You don't have what stops it. Stay at the threshold." "What do you need?" His voice was stripped of everything except the question itself. No king register, no protocol. Just the words. "Time," she said. 2 minutes. Keep the 3 of them out of this room." A pause. Then, "Done." She heard him move and she stopped tracking him and put everything she had back into the floor. The thing below the boundary was immense in the way geological features are immense. Not comprehensible at human scale. Not a thing with a face or a psychology she could negotiate with. A force that had been compressed for millennia into a space that could not hold it and was now finding the pressure differentials that would allow expansion. It was not malicious in any personal sense. It was the thing it was, and what it was required space, and the mortal world had space, and the only thing that had ever kept the 2 of those facts from producing catastrophe was the membrane that her bloodline existed to maintain. She found the crack through her palms, 6 inches of opened boundary, which was vast at the scale that mattered. Each inch of open boundary at this depth corresponded to something large enough that measuring it in mortal world distances was inadequate. She found it the way you find a break in a wall in total darkness, by running your hands along the surface until the cold gets specific. Then she found the thing's extension inside the crack. It registered her immediately. What happened next was not a battle in any sense that the word battle usually carried. There were no weapons, no positions, no tactical decisions made in the space of seconds. It was a contest between incompatible orders, the thing below pressing outward in its nature, Aurelia pressing inward in hers, both of them exerting force along the same axis in opposite directions. The question of which force was stronger was not a question of raw power. Raw power, the thing below had in quantities she could not compete with directly. What she had was different and harder to quantify. The specific, precise, calibrated authority of the boundary's designated maintenance system. The right key for the lock, rather than a bigger hammer. But the key was not yet complete, and the lock had been broken for 2,000 years. The awakening was still coming. She could feel it building in the place behind her sternum, the pressure accumulating, more of the old power coming online in the way a flooded system comes back online, one chamber at a time, not all at once. She needed it all at once. She needed it faster than it was arriving. She thought about the people above her. The boy on the market stall. The woman repairing the mosaic. The craftsman's district. The ordinary Tuesday of 100,000 lives that were going to end underground in the dark if she couldn't hold the crack closed for the 90 seconds it would take for the rest of the awakening to reach the point she needed. She held. Her nose started bleeding, warm on her upper lip, tasting of iron and salt, dripping to the frost-covered stone. She held. The darkness pressed harder and she felt something give. Not the crack, but something internal, some barrier between what she was currently capable of and what the full awakening required. A wall inside her own blood that hadn't been there in the hollow and hadn't been there in the valley, but was here now, at the precise moment she needed to go past it. She understood, in the way the death zone had taught her to understand things, not intellectually, but in the body, in the blood, that the wall was fear, not fear of the thing below. Fear of what she would be on the other side of the wall, what her bloodline was at full expression, what it had been before the destruction, what it made her in the mortal world's terms. Not the cursed girl, not the failed Omega, something that the mortal world's power structures had spent 2,000 years making sure would never fully exist. The wall was the residue of 22 years of being told that what she was wrong. The thing below pushed. The crack widened. Something cracked in the ceiling above her. A structural sound. Stone under pressure that stone was not designed to manage. She heard Crestholt's voice from the doorway, past Darius, sharp and carrying. She can't hold it. This was always the projection. The bloodline's awakening is incomplete. She doesn't have the capacity. If you let her fail here, the breach becomes uncontainable, and the Empire becomes the negotiating chip we've always intended it to. "Shut his mouth," Darius said. Not to Crestholt, to someone. She heard the specific sound of a struggle, brief and one-sided. Then Darius's voice, closer, at the threshold. "Aurelia." "Still busy," she said. Her voice came out more ragged than she intended. "I read the third document," he said. "The correspondence." She held the crack. "I know you did. I need you to understand what I'm going to say in the next 30 seconds, and then I need you to focus on what you're doing." The crack. The pressure. The blood on her lip. "Say it fast." "I believe them," he said, and the words had a different quality from when he'd said them upstairs, stripped of everything she might have read as self-defense. "I believe them, and I chose to believe them, and I did not ask the questions that would have given me answers I didn't want to have. That is not a mistake. That is a choice. I made it, and I made it about you specifically, and I will carry what that cost you for the rest of my life. I am not asking you to forgive it." A pause. "I'm telling you that what's on the other side of whatever you're fighting right now is worth fighting for. Not the throne, not the Empire's structure, the people in it, who did not make my choices, who deserve to not die underground because of what the men I trusted have been doing for 30 years. She heard that. She heard all of it. She filed it in the place where she had been keeping the things she couldn't process in real time and would need to return to when the world gave her a moment. And then she went through the wall, not gradually. The way she had gone into the tide, gone directly, with the full weight of the decision. The way you go through a thing when you have calculated that the cost of not going through it is higher than the cost of going through it, and there is no third option. The awakening completed. Every channel opened simultaneously. The unspooling ran to its end, and what it found at the end was not the partial system she'd been operating with for 8 months. It was the full architecture of what the Shadow Realm's bloodline was designed to be, running at the capacity it had been designed to run at. And the flood of it through her nervous system was not comfortable and was not graceful and made her vision go entirely white for 3 seconds, during which she pressed her palms harder against the floor and did not let go of the crack. When her vision came back, the chamber looked different. She could see the boundary the way she could see the hollow's darkness. Not through it, but its structure, its texture, the precise geography of where it was intact and where it had been compromised. The crack was visible to her now as a physical feature rather than a sensation, 6 inches of opened membrane approximately 30 feet below the chamber floor, with the thing's extension pressed through it in a column approximately 4 feet in diameter. She could see exactly what needed to happen. She closed her hands. Not literally. She was already pressing her palms to the floor. But the blood-deep mechanism that her bloodline had been built for, the maintenance of the boundary, the management of the membrane between worlds, she engaged it fully for the first time, and it engaged back the way a long unused system engages when the right operator finally sits down at it, with the eagerness of something that has been waiting for its correct function. The crack began to close. The thing below did not accept this passively. The pressure it exerted in the next 40 seconds was beyond anything she had felt in the death zone, beyond the hollow's testing, beyond the extension's initial push. It was the full weight of what had been contained for 2,000 years, asserting itself against the mechanism of its containment, and the force of it came up through the floor and into her palms and through her blood in waves that she could feel in her bones, in the structure of her teeth, in the backs of her eyes. She did not let go, because this was the thing about the boundary's maintenance that had not been in the mortal world's scholarship, had been deliberately removed from it, along with everything else that told the true history of what her bloodline was for. The maintenance mechanism was not strength-based. It was not a matter of pushing harder than the thing being contained. The boundary closed not because the keeper was more powerful than what it held, but because the keeper was the right kind of thing. The lock did not require force. It required the right key. She was the right key. The crack closed. Not all at once. 4 seconds of closing, 1 inch at a time, the membrane sealing along its length from both ends toward the center. The way a wound closes under the right conditions, and each inch of sealing sent a feedback through her that was the physical sensation of something going right after a very long time of going wrong. The last half inch. The thing below hit the membrane with everything it had. She felt it in her spine, in her back teeth, in the blood running down her upper lip, and the frost on the stone under her palms, and the fine cracks radiating from her knees and the chamber floor from the sustained pressure. She felt it in the mate bond she'd been keeping walled off, felt the walls shake as whatever Darius was experiencing at the threshold translated through the bond in a frequency she hadn't blocked. She did not let go. The last half-inch closed. The silence afterward was absolute. The tide withdrew. Not slowly, instantaneously, the way darkness withdraws when a light source is introduced. The corruption dark went back through the floor, the threads and sheets of it retracting with the speed of something that had been cut off from its source and was now simply disconnected matter returning to equilibrium. The frost on the walls began to melt. The cracks in the ceiling were still there. The structural damage was real and would need real remediation. The world didn't undo damage because the thing causing it was stopped. It just stopped getting worse. She took her palms off the floor. Her hands were shaking in a way that had nothing to do with weakness. The system had been running at full capacity for the first time, and it was cycling down the way an engine shakes after running at redline. She looked at her palms. The skin was marked where she'd pressed against the frost-covered stone, the pattern of the chamber floor in red lines across her hands. She stood up. The standing took longer than it should have. Her legs held, but the holding required a conversation with her legs that she usually didn't need to have. When she was upright, she turned. The chamber was the chamber again. Damaged, frost-wet, the ward channels broken, the surface markings cracked. Work that would need to be done, carefully, systematically, over time. The boundary below was closed, but not healed. Sealed with the mechanism it was designed to be sealed with, which meant it would hold. But holding was not the same as repaired. Darius was at the threshold. Crestholt was behind him with both his arms held by two palace guards who had apparently arrived at some point during the last few minutes, which she noted with dim approval. Duval was against the wall with the particular posture of someone who has recently been crying and is working hard to not appear to be. Thornwick was not present, which she also noted and would address later. She walked toward the threshold. Darius watched her walk. His face had gone through whatever it had gone through while she was kneeling on the chamber floor and had arrived at something that was not any of the faces she had seen from him before. Not the king's face. Not the boy she'd grown up beside. Not the man on the platform who hadn't looked at her. Something that existed after all of those, on the other side of whatever the last 15 minutes had been. She stopped at the threshold. "The crack is sealed," she said, "temporarily. The wards need to be rebuilt, and that requires time, and it requires the people who've been sabotaging them removed from any access to this level." "Already handled," he said. His voice was not doing anything except carrying information. "I need you to tell me what rebuilding the wards requires. I'll tell you what it requires. I'll also need a list of every member of the council with bloodline access to this level in the last 30 years. She looked past him at Crestholt, starting with his entire family tree. Crestholt said, "You have no standing in this empire. You are an exile by decree." "By your decree," Darius said, and the words landed in the corridor with the specific weight of a king who has finished deciding something and is no longer in the process of deciding it. "Engineered by your council, documented in materials that are currently being read by my head archivist and two independent bloodline scholars." He looked at Crestholt with an expression that was entirely unambiguous. "You will be quiet." Crestholt was quiet. She looked at Darius. He looked back at her. There was a conversation happening in the looking. Not the conversation of the platform, not the grief and the looking away and the deliberate distance. A different conversation, newer, built from what had just happened in this chamber and the 8 months before it, and the 30-year history of a manipulation that had shaped both of them. She did not know yet where that conversation ended. She was not sure enough of the terrain to try to navigate toward any specific destination. But the conversation was happening. That was different from before. "The Eastern District corruption," she said. "The boundary sealing will have reduced the spread pressure, but the existing manifestations need to be addressed. I need to go there." "I'll have a unit ready in 15 minutes, he said. "I don't need a unit." "I know you don't need one," he said. "I'm sending one anyway. For the people in the Eastern District who have never seen anything like what's happening to their neighborhood and are going to need to see something that looks like their king's response, not just a single person walking into the dark by herself." She considered this. It was not wrong. "Fine." She started toward the stairs. "Aurelia." He said her name the way she said his, or without the title, without the protocol, the way that was native to a history of having known each other before either of them had anything to be formal about. The mate bond. She stopped. I can feel it again, he said, since you went into the tide. The wall you had up came down while you were... He paused. I felt what you felt. She did not turn around. That is not an uncomplicated thing to tell me, she said. No, he said. It isn't. She stood still for 3 seconds, at the foot of the stairs in the damaged chamber with the frost melt dripping from the walls and the broken ward markings around her feet, and everything that had been, and everything that was, and everything that was not yet determined running simultaneously in her chest. We will talk about it, she said. After. She went up the stairs. The Eastern District was 6 blocks of urban darkness that no amount of torchlight reached. She stood at its edge with the military unit Darius had assembled, 12 soldiers, 2 bloodline advisors, a street captain named Orvin, who had the look of a man who had been managing this situation on almost no information for the better part of a week and was desperate for anyone who appeared to know what they were doing. How far in have you been able to go? She said to Orvin. Half a block, he said. We lose people after that. Not to anything we can fight. They just... He stopped. They stopped responding. The ones we've gotten back can't describe what happened. They're physically unhurt, but they're not... He searched for the word. They're not tracking right. Afterward, she understood. The corruption dark in the mortal world was not the same as the death zone's darkness, which she had learned to navigate. This was boundary breach contamination in organic matter, the biological equivalent of the ward channel damage Crestholt had spent 30 years inflicting. It didn't kill. It deconstructed the relationship between a person's internal architecture and the world outside it. The resulting state was not unconsciousness. It was closer to being unable to find the exit. Stay here, she said to the unit. You too, she said to the 2 bloodline advisors, who were looking at the dark with the expressions of people whose professional training had significantly failed to prepare them for this. If anyone goes in behind me without my explicit direction, they will be in the dark with no compass, and I won't be able to manage both the darkness and the search for them simultaneously. Stay at the perimeter. Be visible. Be loud if you have to. Sound carries. Orvin nodded. She walked into the dark. It was different from the inside than the outside. The mortal world's corruption dark had a texture she hadn't fully registered from the perimeter. Denser than the death zone's standard darkness, less organized, the chaotic dark of a system behaving outside its design parameters. She could see through it with the shadow silver eyes, but the seeing was more effortful here than in the realm, requiring the same kind of active attention that night vision requires in deep darkness. She moved through 6 blocks methodically. 3 residents in the first 2 blocks, disoriented and non-responsive in the way Orvin had described, sitting in doorways or against walls with the blankness of people whose navigation systems had been interrupted. She reached each of them, made physical contact, her hand on their face, direct skin contact, and through the boundary maintenance mechanism pushed back enough coherence into their immediate space that the blankness retreated and the person inside returned to their own surface. It was not a clean process. It cost something each time, not the catastrophic cost of the chamber work, but a measurable expenditure. She noted the expenditure and kept moving. The 4th resident was at the district's center, which was where the corruption's ground-level origin point had been. A man in late middle age sitting in the entrance to what had been a bakery, looking at his hands. When she touched his face, the blankness retreated and he looked at her with the gradual return of someone surfacing from very deep water. What is it? He said. His voice was cracked from disuse but entirely present. What's in the ground? She crouched in front of him. Something that's been in the ground a long time, she said. It pushed too hard and cracked through. I've sealed the crack. What you're feeling will start clearing. He looked at her eyes, at the silver. Are you the one who makes it stop? Yes, she said. He nodded, the simple nod of someone who has been in the dark long enough to have shed the luxury of skepticism and is working purely on whether the information in front of them is useful. Then make it stop, he said. She stood up. She moved to the district's center and pressed her palms to the ground. The source point was here, where the corruption dark had first manifested at street level, which mapped directly above the breach in the chamber below, the way a leak maps above its source if the structure between them is simple enough. She could feel the residual pressure of the sealed crack through 60 feet of stone and dirt, and she could feel the contamination that had spread outward from the source point in the weeks before she arrived. Containing it was methodical work rather than crisis work. The crisis was resolved. This was the aftermath, painstaking, necessary, unglamorous. The management of what happens after the decisive moment, which is always more work than the decisive moment itself, and gets less acknowledgement because it doesn't have the same narrative shape as the moment of maximum danger. She worked through the district for 4 hours, block by block. The soldiers and the street captain, following at the perimeter she'd indicated, called out when they saw the dark begin to thin in sections, visible from the outside as a clearing, the streetlight coming back into blocks that had been lightless for days. She heard Orvin's voice 3 times, brief and professional, coordinates and conditions, the language of a man doing his job with care. When she came out of the last block, the Eastern District's darkness was gone. The streets were not back to normal. There were the physical signs of a week of contamination, the structural changes to buildings closest to the source point, the residue on surfaces that would need to be cleaned. The residents emerging from doorways and upper floors had the look of people who had survived something and were not yet sure what it had cost them. But they were emerging, blinking in the light that the torches and the dawn, actual dawn, the real dawn, the sun coming up over the Capitol's roofline, were providing. Orvin looked at her. He started to say something and then didn't, which she understood as the response of a professional who had been trained to report and had encountered a situation that didn't fit any of the reporting categories he'd been given. "Captain," she said. "Ma'am? You held the perimeter well." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and something in his shoulders changed by half a degree. Darius was at the district's edge. He had not been there when she went in. He was there when she came out, standing in the space where the dark and the light met. In his working clothes with a sword at his hip he hadn't had in the War Council chamber, looking at the cleared darkness with the expression of a man who has been waiting with concentrated attention for an outcome he couldn't control. She stopped 3 feet from him. The dawn was coming up orange and pink behind the eastern rooflines, extravagant and ordinary simultaneously, the way dawn is. Around them the soldiers were standing down, the residents were moving, the city was beginning to process the fact that the thing that had been happening to its eastern district had stopped. "The wards," she said. "The archivist is already documenting the damage for the rebuilding assessment," he said. "Crestholt, detained. All 5 members of his extended family with council access. Thornwick was apprehended at the southern gate." A pause. "He was trying to leave." She nodded. "Duval, she's talking," he said. "She's been talking since the chamber. Everything." His voice was carefully flat around that word. Everything. She understood that everything covered a significant amount of ground that she would need to read at some point, in detail, and that reading it was going to be hard in a way that the Death Zone had not prepared her for, because the Death Zone's hardness was about survival, and this was going to be about comprehension, about understanding the full architecture of what had been done to her bloodline, to the kingdom 2,000 years ago, and the granular documentary detail that Duval's talking was apparently providing. "How many more?" she said. "Of the council?" "Of Crestholt's network." He was quiet for a moment. "Enough that the council as it currently exists is not functional as a governance body," he said. "Enough that—" He stopped. "The empire I thought I was running is not the empire I was running." This was one of the hardest things a person who holds power can say about themselves. Not the admitting of a specific mistake, which is manageable because it is bounded. The acknowledgement that the mistake was the foundation, that what you built your confidence on was not the thing you thought it was. That requires a kind of intellectual and moral honesty that power does not usually cultivate, because power tends to create environments where that kind of honesty is professionally inadvisable. He had said it anyway. She did not minimize it. "No," she said. "It isn't. What the empire needs to become," he said carefully, "requires your presence in it, not as the ward of a minor noble house, not as—" He stopped. She could see him choosing words with the precision of a man who had spent the last 4 hours thinking about how to say something. The Bloodline Ward architecture needs its keeper. The boundary below the capital needs active maintenance now that the crack has been introduced. The corruption in the Eastern Territories didn't start here. There are source points in the old border territories, in the Western Lowlands, in the Valley provinces. This isn't one location, it's systemic. She looked at him. I know, she said. Then you know what I'm trying to say. I know what you're trying to say, she said. I also know that what I am now and what I was when you sentenced me to exile are the same person. I didn't become what I am because you exiled me. I was already this. The exile gave me the conditions to realize it. She looked at the clearing dawn over the eastern roofline. I am not returning to the empire I was exiled from. That empire treated what I was as a defect to be managed. I am not manageable. I know that, he said. I am the queen of a realm that predates this one. My obligation runs to its maintenance first, to the boundary, to the people on both sides of it. That obligation does not sit below the empire's governance structure. It exists alongside it, separately. I understand, he said. The empire's governance structure needs to be rebuilt, she said. That work is yours. I can advise the boundary-related elements, the political reconstruction. That's your task, not mine. He was looking at her with the expression she had seen from him at the chamber threshold, the one that existed on the other side of everything. And between us, he said, outside the governance question. The mate bond sat between them in the dawn, no longer walled off, no longer pretending it was sealed. She could feel his end of it, the guilt still, the complex thing she'd seen under the king's face in the War Council chamber, something newer and more tentative that she didn't have a complete reading on yet. Between us, she said, is a longer conversation than either of us has had sleep for. A pause, and then, faint and unexpected, he almost smiled. Not at the situation, at the phrasing of her response, the specific wording of it, which contained a door that she had not explicitly closed. She turned away from him toward the clearing district. The ward documentation, she said. I want to see it this afternoon. I'll have it ready, he said. She walked toward the dawn. The shadow-silver eyes caught the first full sunlight of the day as she turned east, and for a moment the light and the darkness in them made something that was neither, something that existed between those two things, the color the seventh had shown her in the valley, the color she was. Behind her, the seven winged shapes were still overhead, catching the thermals of a morning that had arrived in a city that almost hadn't survived the night. Below her, 60 feet of stone and the sealed membrane of the boundary, holding. Around her, the work that was not done. She walked toward it with the knowledge of what she was, running at full capacity, in a world that had spent 2,000 years making sure she would never know it. And the knowledge did not make her triumphant. It made her ready. Readiness was better than triumph. Triumph was a moment. Readiness was what you brought to every moment after it. But below the sealed crack, below the stone, below the ward channels, below the boundary membrane that she had closed with the specific authority of her bloodline's oldest function, the thing that had been imprisoned for 2,000 years was not done. It had been sealed before. Twice, in the history that the seventh had given her on those long nights in the death zone. Both times, it had found a way back. And as Aurelia walked into the morning with the boundary holding and the Eastern District clearing and the Empire beginning the slow work of understanding what had been done to it, the thing below pressed one slow, deliberate, patient hand against the sealed membrane and waited. It was very good at waiting. The thing below did not wait long. 3 days after the Eastern District cleared, the second breach happened. Not in the capital. In the Valley provinces 200 miles southwest, a town called Ashthorn that sat on the Empire's oldest trade route and had been, according to the territorial reports Aurelia read in the War Council chamber, that had become, in the absence of a functional council, her operational headquarters, showing corruption symptoms for 6 weeks without anyone in the administrative chain recognizing them as boundary symptoms rather than ordinary environmental contamination. The report arrived at dawn on the third day, and she was already reading the ward documentation from the night before when Darius brought it to her, and she read it once and put it down and looked at the map. How far is Ashthorn from the nearest secondary ward anchor, she said. He moved to the map and pointed. 40 miles. The Greyvale marker. Is the Greyvale marker intact? A pause that told her the answer before he said it. We don't know. It hasn't been formally inspected in How long? 17 years. She looked at the map. At the distances between the capital's foundation chambers and the valley provinces and the old border territories and the western lowlands. At the web of ward anchors that the Shadow Realm's original architecture had installed across the mortal world's geography 2,000 years ago, now mostly undocumented, partially sabotaged, their maintenance records falsified or absent, the knowledge of their locations scattered across archive materials that Crestholt's network had been quietly degrading for 3 decades. She had sealed the crack. The thing below had found a different seam. This was the nature of containment work. It was not a single act. It was the sustained application of the correct kind of attention to a problem that did not stop generating pressure simply because you pushed back against it once. The 2 previous sealings the 7th had described had failed not because the keepers lacked power, but because they had treated the work as event rather than practice. Sealed the crack and stepped back and called it resolved. She was not going to make that mistake. But she was one person. "I need the full ward anchor map," she said. "Whatever exists in the archive materials, whatever Duval's testimony has produced, whatever the bloodline scholars can reconstruct from secondary sources. Every anchor location, every maintenance record, every gap in the documentation. I need it in one place within 3 days." "I can have people on it today," Darius said. "And I need to go to Ashthorn." He didn't argue. "I'll ride with you." She looked at him. "The Empire's king riding to a town in active boundary crisis is a governance statement," he said. "It tells every territorial administrator that this is not a localized anomaly being managed by specialists. It tells them the throne treats this as a primary threat." A pause. "It also means you're not riding 200 miles alone." She looked at the map for another moment. "We leave within the hour." Balsag. Ashthorn was worse than the Eastern District. The Eastern District had been 1 degree of contamination, the spread from a single source point through a contained urban geography. Ashthorn was the source. The breach here was not secondary to the capital's crack. It was independent, a separate seam in the membrane, a separate point of pressure from below, which meant the thing was not attacking from one direction, but from multiple simultaneously. She understood, riding into the valley town with Darius and the military escort at her back, that this was the strategic reality of what she was dealing with. The entity below the boundary was not a brute force. It was a patient, distributed intelligence that had spent 2,000 years mapping the membrane's weaknesses the way water maps the weaknesses in a riverbank. The capital crack had been the most obvious pressure point, the one that the degraded ward architecture made accessible first, but it had been pressing on all of them. Ashthorn's contamination had consumed the town's outer ring completely. Buildings at the perimeter had the structural damage she'd seen in the capital's foundation chamber, the physical signature of sustained boundary pressure on mortal world matter, stone and wood and brick reorganizing at the molecular level towards something that wasn't stone or wood or brick anymore. The residents who hadn't evacuated in time were in the same non-responsive state as the capital's Eastern District victims, but deeper in it, the longer exposure producing something that was harder to reverse. She worked through the town for 6 hours. Darius worked beside her. Not in the boundary sense. He had no bloodline mechanism for the boundary work, but he had 2 hands and a soldier's training and the practical intelligence to follow her instructions precisely and without the delay of consultation. When she told him which residents needed to be moved before she cleared the contamination from a given block, he moved them. When she identified the source point and needed 40 minutes of undisturbed work at the town center, he positioned the escort in a perimeter pattern that kept the workspace clear without requiring her to manage the positioning herself. She noticed this and filed it without stopping to examine it, because the working was not the time for examining things. When the 6th hour ended and she stood up from the town center's source point with the secondary breach sealed and the contamination clearing block by block, in the visible way she'd come to recognize, Darius was beside her with water and the sustained quiet of someone who has been holding a space for another person's work and understands that the holding is itself a kind of contribution. She drank the water. He waited. "There are more," she said. "The ward anchor map will show us how many and where, but there are more." "I know," he said. "This is going to be the work," she said. "Not a campaign with an end date, not a crisis to be managed and closed. This is the ongoing function of what the boundary requires. It needed a keeper for 2,000 years, and it didn't have one. The deferred maintenance doesn't resolve in a season. He looked at the clearing town, at the residents beginning to move again, the non-responsive ones coming back to themselves with the gradual surfacing quality she had come to recognize, the slow return of a person from the deep water of boundary contamination to the surface of their own life. "How long?" he said. "For the full restoration of the ward network? Years, possibly a decade." She looked at the horizon. "For the entity below to stop pressing, I don't know. The seventh told me it's been pressing for 2,000 years. I don't have a projection on when it stops." "Then the Empire needs to be structured around this," he said. "Not a question, not a delegation. A governance statement from a king who has revised his model of what his kingdom requires. The ward anchor locations need to be protected, maintained, staffed by people who understand their function. The knowledge that was removed from the scholarship needs to be restored. The administrative chain needs reporting categories for boundary symptoms that don't currently exist." He paused. "None of that happens without you at the center of it." She turned and looked at him directly. The afternoon light in the valley was ordinary and warm, in the way that ordinary light became remarkable after a period of darkness, and it fell across his face in the way of things that don't know they're being observed, and therefore don't perform for the observation. "I said the conversation would happen after," she said. "This is after," he said. She considered that. The geography of after was unfamiliar. She had spent the preceding 8 months in before and during, and after had been an abstraction, a theoretical state she was working toward. Standing in it in the sunlight of a recovering valley town was different from how she had imagined it during the Death Zone's dark nights. "What you did on the platform," she said, "was not a single event. It was the last event in a sequence that Crestholt's network constructed over years. I know that now. I knew it intellectually when I read the third document." She stopped. "Knowing it and experiencing its emotional weight as something other than betrayal are different processes, and I am still in the middle of the second one." "I know," he said. "I am not at the end of that process," she said. "I don't know when I will be." "I'm not asking for the end of it," he said. "I'm asking for, He stopped, and she saw him doing what she had watched him do in the War Council chamber, choosing words with the precision of a man who has learned, recently and expensively, that imprecision in important moments has consequences. "I'm asking to be present during it, not to accelerate it, not to be forgiven on any timeline that isn't yours. To be present." The mate bond between them was neither walled off nor fully open. It was doing the thing that mate bonds do when both parties are awake to them, without having resolved what that means, carrying information in both directions without interpretation. She could feel the asking in his end of it, not the king's asking, not the formal request of someone negotiating a political arrangement, the raw asking of a person who has lost something significant and has understood finally what the losing cost. She could also feel, in her own end of it, that the wall she had built in the death zone was not something she wanted to maintain permanently, not because the wound was healed, it wasn't, but because permanent walls and mate bonds are not protection. They are a different kind of damage, slower and quieter, the damage of keeping something sealed that was designed to move. "Presence isn't restoration," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's a beginning." She was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. Then she said, "The ward anchor documentation, when we return to the capital." "It will be ready," he said. "Then we work," she said. She turned toward the escort and the horses and the road back, and he fell in beside her, and the valley's afternoon light followed them both out of the town. The trial took 3 weeks. Aurelia did not attend every session. She attended 4. The opening, the presentation of the ward documentation evidence, the testimony of the bloodline scholars who had spent 2 weeks reconstructing the history that Crestholt's network had spent 30 years degrading, and the final session where the verdicts were read. The verdicts were not lenient. The Empire's law, applied to the full documentation of what had been done, produced sentences that were proportionate in a way that left no comfortable distance between the crime and its consequence. Crestholt and the principal members of his network received what the law prescribed for acts of deliberate undermining of the Empire's foundational security over a sustained period. Duval, whose testimony had been comprehensive and whose cooperation had materially accelerated the prosecution, received a reduced sentence that was still not comfortable. Thornwick, caught at the southern gate, had attempted to negotiate. The negotiation had failed because what he was offering, further information about the network's reach, was information the prosecution already had, in more accurate form, from Duval. He received the full measure. The trials were public. This had been Darius's decision, made against the advice of the 3 council members who remained and who argued, with the logic of institutional self-preservation, that public trials would destabilize confidence in the governance structure. He had overruled them on the grounds that the only thing more destabilizing to governance than a public accounting of corruption was the absence of one. The populations did not forget what they knew had happened, and that official silence on known events did not produce confidence, but rather a specific kind of corrosive uncertainty that was worse than the discomfort of public accountability. He was not wrong. The trials were followed throughout the empire with the concentrated attention of populations that have been given the formal opportunity to watch the thing that was done to them named and addressed. The naming mattered almost as much as the verdict. People needed to hear the structure of the betrayal described in language that acknowledged its scale. Aurelia watched the final session from the chamber's upper gallery. When the verdicts were read and Crestholt's face processed them, the processing happening in public, which was the point, she felt nothing she would describe as satisfaction. Satisfaction implied that the accounting had closed something. What she felt was something more like the completion of a structural step, the way setting a bone feels like completion rather than satisfaction, the rightness of a thing being put back in the position it's supposed to occupy so that healing can happen. The wound was still there. The bone was set. Those were different things, and both of them were true. The ward anchor map, when it was complete, covered an entire wall of the War Council chamber. 214 anchor points across the Empire's territory, mapped from Duval's testimony, the archive materials, the Bloodline Scholars' reconstruction, and 3 pieces of information provided by the 7th through the pressure communication method that Aurelia had learned to use as a bidirectional channel. Of the 214, 67 were confirmed intact. 42 were confirmed damaged by Crestholt's network's maintenance sabotage. The remaining 105 were unknown, undocumented, unvisited, their current states requiring physical inspection to determine. She stood in front of the map for a long time the first morning it was complete. The scale of the work was not abstract anymore. It was cartographic, specific, each anchor point a location with coordinates and access notes, and a damage assessment and a priority ranking based on the boundary pressure. Mapping the 7th had helped her develop during the 2 weeks since Ashthorn. The critical anchors, the ones whose failure would produce immediate breach conditions, numbered 23. Those 23 needed to be personally assessed, and where damaged, repaired before the boundary work could move into the slower maintenance phase. She started planning routes. Darius came to stand beside her. He had been doing this, appearing beside her rather than summoning her, working in the same space rather than across a formal governance table for the past week, and she had noted it and not addressed it, which was its own form of acknowledgement. The western lowlands anchors are the most remote, she said, pointing. 6 of them. The access routes are seasonal. We need to reach them before the winter closes the mountain passes. 6 weeks if we start next week, he said. He had been studying the map too. 5 if we don't lose days to weather. I'll have the supply arrangements made. He paused. All 6 in a single route? It's more efficient than separate expeditions. She looked at the anchor positions. The northern ones can wait for spring. The Valley Province cluster needs attention before the western lowlands, given Ashthorn. How many can be delegated, he said. Once you've trained the Bloodline Scholars in the inspection protocol. The repair work can't be delegated, she said. Not yet. The scholars can inspect and assess. The repair requires the bloodline mechanism. That's mine. She paused. Eventually, the knowledge can be distributed more broadly. The original ward network had multiple trained keepers. What Crestholt's network destroyed was not just the infrastructure, it was the institutional knowledge. Rebuilding that is a generation's work. Then we begin a generation's work, he said. She looked at him. He said it simply, without the weight of sacrifice or the shape of a gesture toward her. Simply a practical statement about a practical timeline, from someone who had recalibrated his understanding of what his reign was for. There is a particular quality of person that emerges from genuine reckoning with a significant wrong they have committed. Not from being caught, not from consequences, but from the interior process of actually looking at what they did and what it cost and rebuilding their operating principles from the honest accounting of it. That process does not produce a better version of the same person. It produces a different person who carries the previous version's history and has chosen to do something different with it. Darius was in the middle of that process. She could see it in the way he occupied a room now, in the way he asked questions rather than asserting, in the way he had restructured the council in the weeks after the trials, removing the institutional buffers that had allowed Crestholt's network to manage his information environment, creating direct reporting lines that went to him without filtration, bringing in bloodline scholars and territorial administrators whose appointment had not been brokered through the corrupted system. She did not tell him she saw it. Some things are done in their being rather than their naming. Bob. The last conversation she had with the Seventh before it withdrew happened on a night 3 weeks after Ashthorn, in the Capitol's foundation chamber where she had gone alone to check the sealed crack. The crack was holding. She could feel it through the floor with her palms, the membrane intact, the thing below pressing at its standard sustained pressure rather than the acute crisis pressure of the breach attempt. The standard pressure was manageable. It would always be there. She was learning to distinguish between the pressure that required response and the pressure that required only maintenance. The Seventh appeared in the chamber with the fluid arrival of its kind. "The realm," she said, without looking up from the floor. "The anchors in the Death Zone's territory, the ones on the far side of the boundary. They hold," it said. "Will they hold without active attention? For a time. They require less attention than the mortal world anchors. The realm's own nature provides a maintenance function, but they are not self-sufficient indefinitely. I'll need to return periodically, yes." She stayed with her palms on the floor for another moment. The connection ran through them into the sealed membrane. Her hands and the stone and the boundary below, the same connection she'd pushed everything through in the chamber crisis, running now at a steady maintenance level, the organism doing its ongoing work rather than its emergency response. "The thing below," she said. "Is it conscious? Does it have an objective beyond expansion?" The Seventh was quiet for longer than it was usually quiet. "It has a nature," it finally said. "The nature is expansion, the occupation of available space. Whether that constitutes consciousness in any sense that produces objective, that is a question the realm has not resolved in 2,000 years of proximity to it." "Is it in pain?" she said. The Seventh's pause this time had a different quality, something she had come to recognize as its version of being brought up short. "That question," it said, "has not previously been asked. I'm asking it now." "I don't know," it said. And then, more carefully, I think it is the nature of something that was made to have space and was given no space that the state of being compressed for 2,000 years would produce something that, in a creature capable of experiencing experience, would map to pain. Whether the entity below is capable of experiencing experience in that sense, we don't know, she said. No. She took her hands off the floor and looked at them. The work-marked palms, the silver thread of the mate bond visible in her wrist, in the way it had become visible since the full awakening. Not to mortal eyes, but to the shadow silver of her own. "The goal isn't to keep it imprisoned forever," she said. "It's to manage the boundary until there's a way to address the source condition, whatever made containment necessary in the first place." "That is," the Seventh said carefully, "a much larger scope of work than boundary maintenance." "Yes," she said. "It is." She stood up. "I'm noting it as a long-term objective, not next year's work, not this generation's work probably, but work." She looked at the Seventh directly. "The bloodline was designed to contain. Was it also designed to eventually release what it contains, when the conditions are right?" The Seventh was very still. "The original architects," it said slowly, "left that question unfinished. They were killed before the answer was recorded." "Then I'll finish it," she said. She said it not as declaration or as ambition, but as orientation. The way a traveler notes a distant destination and then turns to the road directly ahead, understanding that the distant destination will be reached by navigating everything between now and it, one day's walking at a time. The seventh withdrew. She stood alone in the foundation chamber with the sealed crack below her, and the damaged ward channels around her and the work of a generation mapped on the wall above her, and she breathed the cold air of the old stone and felt the complete awakening running through her blood at its maintenance level. Constant, ordinary, the opposite of the crisis pitch it had hit in the tide. This was what it felt like to be what she was. Not triumphant, not powerful in the way the mortal world constructed power, the domination and accumulation and visible authority over others. Something more like being the correct function of a necessary mechanism, operating at the capacity it was designed for, doing the work it was built to do. She had spent 22 years being told that the absence of visible power was the absence of power. The Death Zone had taught her a different definition, the one that the Shadow Realm's bloodline had always carried. Power is not what you impose on the world. It is what you are willing to maintain in it, to wake up every day and do the work that keeps the boundary holding, to ride to Ashthorn when Ashthorn needs you, and to ride to the western lowlands before winter closes the passes, and to put your palms on the floor of a cold stone chamber and check whether the crack is holding. To choose, again and again, the ordinary practice of the necessary over the spectacular performance of the powerful. This was not wisdom she had arrived at cleanly. It had been extracted from her by the Death Zone's grinding process, by the Hollow's testing, by 3 weeks of surviving things that killed everyone else and asking, in the doing of the surviving, what the surviving was for. Now she knew. She went up the stairs. Darius was in the corridor, not waiting, reading something from the stack of ward documentation he carried everywhere now because he had made the ward network reconstruction a personal focus rather than a delegated task. Because he had decided, in whatever interior process he was still working through, that the closest thing to adequate response to what had been done under his reign was to be present and working, rather than to gestures toward adequate and look away. He looked up when she came through the door. "The crack is holding," she said. He nodded. "The supply arrangements for the Western Lowlands route are confirmed. 7 horses, 2 bloodline scholars who've completed the inspection protocol training, 4 soldiers, Orvin's recommendation." "Good choice," she said. Orvin had turned out to be exactly the kind of person you wanted in situations that required someone to hold a perimeter without requiring constant instruction. They stood in the corridor. The palace around them was alive in the way it had been before the crisis, and different in the way of things that have survived something and know it. The servants moving with the particular efficiency of people who have been through a hard period and are not taking the ordinary for granted. The guards at their positions with an attentiveness that hadn't been there before the Eastern District went dark. "I want to ask you something," Darius said, "and I want you to understand that it doesn't require an answer tonight, or this season. It requires whatever time it requires." She looked at him. "The Empire's governance," he said, "needs restructuring at a level that is beyond administrative reorganization. The council system, the bloodline ranking hierarchy, the way territorial authority is distributed and checked, all of it has fault lines that Crestholt's network exploited because the system was built with those fault lines. They're not anomalies. They're features of how the Empire was designed." He paused. "I need someone who can see the fault lines from outside the system, who has reason to care about the people the system has always been willing to discard." She understood what he was asking. Not a formal governance title, not a position in the hierarchy. Something that didn't exist yet, that would need to be built rather than assigned. A function. The same way the boundary maintenance had been a function that existed whether or not the Empire had formal acknowledgement of it. "The ward anchor work comes first," she said. "I know. The Western Lowlands, then the Valley Province cluster, then the Northern anchors in the spring. The governance conversation happens on the road and in the evenings, not at the expense of the boundary work." "On the road," he repeated. Something in the words arrived at him. "Yes." She looked at him for a moment with the shadow silver eyes that had been seeing the structure of things since the Hollow, the weight-bearing elements, the fault lines, the connections that ran between visible surfaces and the things beneath them. What she saw in him was not the king who hadn't looked at her on the platform. That person was present in him the way past selves are always present, carried, not shed. But the person doing the carrying had changed in the specific way that genuine reckoning with a genuine wrong produces change. not erasure, restructure. She did not offer forgiveness. Forgiveness was not a thing she could manufacture on a timeline that matched his need for it. It was a thing that arrived, if it arrived, as the product of time and the evidence of time, of watching someone be different than they were, and arriving eventually at a place where the being different had weight. What she offered instead was presence, the same thing he had asked for in the valley town. "The morning after next," she said, "we leave for the western lowlands." He nodded once. She walked past him toward the corridor's end, where the palace's upper floor led out onto a balcony that faced east, the direction of the death zone, the direction she had walked into in chains and walked back out of carrying everything she'd found in the going. The city below the balcony was lit, alive, full of the ordinary noise of a population that had survived the dark and was doing what populations do when they've survived something, feeding itself, arguing, rebuilding, telling the story of what happened with the gradual inaccuracy of stories that are still too recent to have settled into their final shape. Overhead, 2 of the winged 7 caught a thermal and wheeled, high enough that the city below couldn't distinguish them from large birds, which was the way she preferred it. Their time to be fully visible would come when she understood better what their visibility would mean in a mortal world that had spent 2,000 years forgetting they existed. She stood at the balcony's edge and looked east until the night's first stars came out. The boundary held below her, and the ward anchors in their 214 positions held or did not hold across the Empire's territory, and the thing below the sealed crack pressed its slow and patient pressure against the membrane. And Queen Aurelia Nightthorn, who had been called the weakest wolf in the Moonfang Empire, who had been sentenced to the death zone in chains before a crowd of thousands, who had walked into the worst place the world had, and walked back out carrying the oldest power in it, stood in the ordinary dark of an ordinary evening and breathed the cool autumn air and understood that the story people would eventually tell about her would get most of it wrong. They would say she returned as a conqueror. She had not. She had returned as a keeper. They would say she triumphed over her enemies. She had addressed a system. Those were different. They would say she was powerful because she was feared, because she commanded ancient forces, because she had faced a corruption god in a foundation chamber and sealed the crack. They would not say, because these things do not translate into the shape of stories that people want to be told. That power, in its most fundamental and necessary form, was not the capacity to dominate. It was the willingness to show up tomorrow and do the same work as today, to not require the story to be spectacular in order to be worth doing. To make the choice, again and again, with full knowledge of the cost and no guarantee of the outcome, to be the thing the world needed maintained rather than the thing that blazed and burned and left the maintenance to someone else. She had been forged in exile. She had been forged in the specific and particular suffering of a person told they were nothing until they were standing in the place that should have killed them and discovering that nothing was not, in fact, what they were. She would carry both of those truths forward, the exile and the discovery, not as wound and compensation, but as the two halves of the same education. You cannot know what you are built for until the world removes everything that isn't it. She had been stripped to the bedrock, and the bedrock had been, all along, exactly sufficient. The stars came out in full, the boundary held, the work continued, and that was enough.